Welcome to the Plague Hive. We're back again with another video, and this time we're talking about the OG assassin, Arakni. Specifically the Huntsman in this case, because there has been just recently the announcement of the next set, The Hunted, which will feature at least one new version of Arakni that we've already seen slip through the cracks, and then potentially 6 or maybe 7 additional ones that we've just seen kind of spoiler ones for, and we're not exactly sure what these cards are going to do. Are they hero cards? Are they demi-heroes? Are they maybe allies that you can summon to the field? That's kind of like still out in the open, and we'll know more about it on December 17th, if I remember correctly. When we will get a little bit more info about how all of this is going to work. But for now, we know the next set is gonna have Arakni in it. It's gonna have a focus on their story after they killed the Emperor and what happened in Volcar as a result of that. That's going to be like lore-wise the focus on the set. But this video is not about the lore of Arakni. This video is going to be sort of a recap about the evolution of Arakni as a deck, specifically Arakni the Huntsman. So we're not going to look at a Blitz, we're not going to look at Solitary Confinement, we're going to look specifically at Classic Constructed, Arakni the Huntsman, and how that deck has evolved in the past 2 years since the release of Dynasty. Since I'm not exactly a great Arakni player, I've just dabbled with them a couple of times at armories and stuff. I've invited with me today Etasus, who is a known, I kind of want to say Arakni historian, basically. Like, he's been playing Arakni from day one, basically. It's his favorite deck in the game. I think that's fair to say. Favorite hero in the game. And he's here today with me on the channel to talk about his favorite subject, his favorite topic of conversation, which is Arakni. So welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's good to be here. I can talk for hours about Arakni. I love this hero. You said it yourself. It's my favorite hero.
Yep.
I agree with that 100%. So glad to be here. Glad to be here.
So that's what we're here for today. We're going to talk about Arakni. We're going to give you a little bit of a recap of what that deck has looked like through the sets. And if you're interested in the lore of the hero, that's not what we're going to cover today. I will refer you to TCG Talk, who has just a couple of days ago put out a great recap lore video about Arakni. So if you want to read up on that or listen up on that, because obviously he's talking about it, I'm going to put a link to that in the description of this video and you can check that out. We're just here to talk about the cards, about what exactly Arakni is doing in the game of Flesh and Blood. So to do that, let's go over to the list. And Etasus has been nice enough to put together a list that basically features his personal Arakni deck lists over the time. We're starting with Dynasty, obviously, which is the first set that Arakni actually, was released with. So there's nothing before that, obviously. And if you go up top here on the left, and you go to the versions of this deck, you can see that it's set up. There's like Dynasty, Outsiders, Dusk Till Dawn. So all of the deck choices are here, and you can just kind of go through them and have a look at for yourself what exactly this hero has been allowed to work with, basically. So what cards were available. Slight word of advice, obviously, this is like Etasus's personal list, so they might not necessarily represent exactly what people were playing at the time. That was what he was playing at the time and the choices that he thought were good for the meta that we had at the time. And he's going to be explaining why exactly he made those choices. So let's start with Dynasty. And maybe before we get into all of this, let's start with the hero themselves, Arakni Huntsman, and their specific hero ability. Whenever you play a card with Contract, you may look at the top card of target opponent's deck, you may put it on the bottom. What's up with that? Like, why is that something that you feel strongly about? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so the hero ability is probably one of the most interesting hero abilities in the game because it doesn't provide direct turn-to-turn value. It's like, when you think about other hero abilities, like take, say, Ira, for example, at the very baseline, it's just your second attack each turn gets +1, which is really good and will impact your turn every single turn. Arakni's ability, though, doesn't really provide any direct value. It's very indirect. It's all about taking a look at your opponent's deck, putting it on bottom, disrupting what they're doing, but not really impacting their turn and not really impacting your turn. That you can use it to impact the current turn by just being able to generate a little bit more silver, but that's probably one of the weaker ways to use it. It's really it's a grand macro ability across the whole game that doesn't really impact the turn, but has a very large impact on the whole gameplay of the matchup in general.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're using this effectively. How I like to use it personally is a way of, I call it reverse pitch stacking,
Mm-hmm.
where I'm taking a look at the cards my opponents are pitching, the cards that I'm looking at on top, and I'm trying to actually stack their deck to be better. For the simple reason of, if I'm making my opponent's second cycle better, it's inherently going to make the first cycle worse,
Yeah.
because you can't make the second cycle better while also keeping the first cycle better. There's a trade-off there. So I'm making their second cycle better on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pitch stacking their deck to smooth out the game, to make it so that their first cycle is worse and their second cycle is better, so that I just get to come in there across the whole game doing a sort of a smoothing effect, being
Okay,
able to
right.
just be reliable there.
So you're
Um,
what you're trying to do is basically make their deck on average over the entire game be slightly more on curve, basically.
exactly,
By
exactly. I don't want
changing the ratios where
to.
usually they're like above rate in the first cycle and then below rate in the second, and you're trying to equalize that basically so that they're playing sort of on your level, where because assassin inherently doesn't really do above rate things, right? That's one of the issues with the class, is like our above rate things are usually in the form of disruption. That's kind of where we get our value, but the numbers of assassin are historically bad. That's kind of like one of the main cornerstones of the class. It doesn't really have great numbers, right? So if we're talking about like value wise, a good assassin turn, we're talking about like a 4 card 13, maybe something like that. That's like a good turn, right? If you go something like, or a 3 card 11 with some disruption tacked onto it, right? That's like a solid assassin turn. If you go like looking for a scrap into CNC as a 3 card play, that's probably value wise one of the best hands that's available in assassin. And that's kind of like,
Hmm.
other decks are looking at that and they're going like, yeah, okay, it's nice, it's 11 value for 3 cards, pretty good, but I can do better on 3 cards than that. Like the
Hmm.
baseline for a lot of aggro decks, especially in modern times, is like 3 card 12 or maybe even above that, right? So they just go like, okay, 0 for 4 into 0 for 4 into 0 for 4. If you look at something like Aurora, right? That's very easily able to do that kind of stuff. And then Assassin just kind of falls behind because we can't even do like a 3 card 11 on average. That's like a very specific hand that can do that. And most of the time it's like, okay, I can maybe do like a 3 card 9 with disruption or something like that. And that's just in terms of like raw numbers, really below rate of what other decks can do. And we kind of make up for it with the disruption. So I guess the idea of saying, okay, I want to kind of like take my opponent and sort of drag them down to what I'm forced to play with in terms of numbers. But the trade off is that once we get to second cycle, they can still continue doing that, which usually wouldn't be the case, right?
Hmm. Yeah, that's the main way that I'm using the ability.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important to smooth out what they're doing for all of the reasons you just mentioned.
Okay.
Um, and the notable thing about this, though, is that reverse pitch stacking is not something that I've been doing the entire time playing Arachne.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at all of the set releases that I've been playing Arachne, and I probably started doing that in like part in Mistveil.
Okay.
I have not been utilizing that level of Arachne's ability for really that long at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a newer thing. So as we're looking at some of these older lists, the way that I'm primarily using the ability back then was, it wasn't necessarily looking for silver. It was
Mm-hmm.
kind of a bit of a different mindset. It was, when I look at the top card, I basically ask, back then, I would ask myself, do I want my opponent to see this now,
Mm-hmm.
later, or never? And then
Mm-hmm.
I'd ask myself, do I think this attack can hit?
Mm-hmm.
And based on those answers, I would either leave it on top or put it on the bottom.
Okay.
And that was my general rule of thumb for how I was playing the Arachne contract Fate Seal ability.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not something that I've been doing recently, because I've been working more on this reverse pitch stacking skill. But for the early days of Arachne, that's what I was doing instead for these first couple of lists, is
Okay.
just prioritizing whether I want my opponent to see the card.
Immediately or like later, or if you think you can hit with a contract, potentially never. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
And just as a quick aside, you just mentioned something called Fate Seal.
Hmm.
Just for anyone that's unfamiliar with the term, it's going to be thrown around a lot in this video probably. Fate Seal is another name for, or like a shortcut for referencing the hero ability of Arachne, based on a card in Magic the Gathering that does exactly this. So it just says, look at the top card of your opponent's deck, you may put it on the top or bottom. And that's called Fate Seal, even though that mechanic shows up, if I'm correct, on one single card in Magic the Gathering. It has kind of been adopted by quite a few members of like the Arachne community to refer to the hero ability, just because it's shorter than saying Arachne's hero ability every single time you want to reference it. So if that kind of confuses you, that's where that term comes from, actually. Sometimes it also gets called like a reverse opt, because that's also kind of what it's doing. Like you're opting the opponent's deck. So either of those terms tend to turn up quite frequently when talking about Arachne and their hero ability specifically. Okay, so let's go over the equipment suit. And just to warn you a little bit, this first part, like the Dynasty era, is going to be a little bit longer because we're going to go over all of the cards. And then a lot of them kind of stay the same as we go through the different stages of the deck. So we're not going to repeat everything every time, obviously. So let's start with the equipment suit here. So we got two equipments first that are like specific to Assassin and that also kind of don't really change in this list. I think they're always in there, which are Black Tech Whisperers and Mask of Perdition. And these two were sort of like the first two cards of a cycle of equipment pieces that Assassin got with later sets that all feature the same kind of basic layout. Like they all have Battle Worn 1, and they all have this ability where you can buy them back at the start of your turn if they're in your graveyard by destroying 2 silver. So they all work the same. If these are in your graveyard, you can pay 2 silver and you can re-equip them. So the idea is that you crack them, you block with them first, you crack them, and then you can buy them back later if you have silver. And that's kind of like what's based or what's baked into sort of like the expected gameplay cycle of Arachne, even though a lot of the times it doesn't actually really work out that way. But that's kind of like ideally you're just swimming in silver from hitting all of these contracts, and you can rebuy these all the time, and then you can get extra block value from them, and you can get extra attack reactions that do something, right? So maybe we start with Mask of Perdition, because I think it's probably the most relevant one out of them. And then we can talk about the others later as they show up.
Yeah, so both Mask of Perdition and Black Tech Whisperers are going to show up in every single list on Arachne. They do show up in different ways, though. The use case of Mask of Perdition and Black Tech Whisperers is completely different than what they are today, back in Dynasty. So back then, with this kind of list here, Mask of Perdition was something that you wanted to activate as much as possible, because you throw that on, say, a Leave No Witnesses. You banish the top 2 cards, and if you're against, say, I don't know, a Phi, you're probably hitting 2 reds. That's 2 silvers. You've now got 2 silvers. You buy back Mask of Perdition at the start of the next turn. You do it again. And you wanted to do that as much as possible to continue draining the deck as much as possible. And then if you ever got a miss on one of those silvers, you would hopefully be able to find a silver somewhere else and get it back. Black Tech Whisperers was one that you weren't buying back very often because it was a lot harder to be generating the silver. So most of the time, Black Tech Whisperers was just a once per game when this hits go again reaction, kind of like Snapdragon Scalers with Battle Worn, but significantly worse than Snapdragon Scalers. But that equipment is crazy.
But like the fact that you can only use it on assassin attacks kind of really narrows the use case you have for this card, unfortunately.
And it needs to hit, and after you've activated, the opponent has a window to play reactions. It's great, but the reason that we run this over Snapdragon is because the 1-block Battle Worn is great, and sometimes being able to recur it is fantastic, but it's still not like amazing or anything. It's good.
Makes sense.
But you weren't buying it back too often. It was pretty much a rare scenario where you get back your Black Tech. You're most of the time just recurring Mask of Perdition back then, and just getting as many banishes as you possibly could.
Because that was kind of like Arachne was in their early history, or I mean pretty much still today. Arachne is like a fatigue deck, right? That's kind of what you're trying to do. You're trying to win by running the opponent out of cards. unlike other fatigue decks in the history of Flesh and Blood, you don't necessarily do this by just being super defensive. That's kind of where Arakni or Assassin in general is unique. You have a way of actively fatiguing the opponent by banishing cards from their deck, right? Like most fatigue decks historically, if you look at the very early days, you had like fatigue Katsu lists that were just kind of leveraging the insane value of Flick Flack mostly. And also way back then you had stuff like what was the name of that? The 2 for 6 that always goes back on the bottom.
Drone of Brutality. That was the card.
Drone of Brutality. Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So drone spam and then like leverage Flick Flack's insane block value to just kind of, fatigue the opponent. And then you had Oldhim as like the second big fatigue deck that was in the game. And Oldhim was kind of like really the worst offender in this category, basically, where Oldhim's plan, especially towards like the later stages when he got a couple of bans in, was really just being so defensive that the opponent ran out of ways to deal you damage, basically. And that was his win condition. And that led to very long games. Like, if anyone remembers Oldhim high days, you routinely had like 2-hour top 8 matches, especially if it was an Oldhim mirror. You could just kind of like go grab lunch, take a shower, take a nap, and they still wouldn't be done, And then now, recently, as we've seen basically today, essentially, we also have Enigma as another subset of this like very defensive fatigue kind of deck, where it's like Count Your Blessings Enigma that just kind of leverages life gain in this case to run you out of cards, so you cannot kill them before you run out of cards, and then they just win by default because their weapon is better than yours. That's kind of where that goes. And Arakni is kind of like unique in that fatigue, subset of decks where they're really trying to actively run you out of cards by banishing cards from your deck. And that's where all the contracts come in. That's where Mask of Perdition comes in, basically. Right.
Mhm.
Then for the rest of the equipment suite, we have Tunic. You're trying to play a long game. Tunic is great. The longer the game goes, the better Tunic gets. Also, at that point, Assassin really didn't have any unique chest equipment, so it was Tunic or play some random common, basically. So you play Tunic. And then we have Goliath Gauntlet, which really is just, you didn't have anything better. So it's Goliath Gauntlet. Like this card keeps popping up in lists that don't have good arm equipment slots. Like we've seen it in Mechanologist a whole bunch of times. We've seen it in Illusionist, actually. Prism played this sometimes, where it was just like, okay, if I can slap this on like a Herald of Erudition, that's now coming in for 7. That's significantly better than 5. So that's kind of like why I'm going with this. And I don't really have any good arm equipments that I have by myself. So it showed up in lists. And Arakni is also like, you just play this, and then your first like CNC or surgical is just kind of better. Like,
yeah.
I don't think anyone was playing this because they were genuinely excited about Goliath Gauntlet. It was just kind of like the best default option that you had access to.
Yeah, there was a very large debate in the early days of Arakni, where it was the question of, do you run Goliath Gauntlet or do you run Iron Rock Gauntlet?
Right.
Yeah, so Goliath Gauntlet, Iron Rock Gauntlet, it was a question of, did you want the benefit that came from Command and Conquer for 8 or Surgical for 6, or did you want the benefit of 1 additional block? And the early days of Arakni, if you look at this list, it's not very good. It wasn't able to present a lot of damage, and so because it couldn't present the damage, you weren't really ever winning through damage. You were always winning through fatigue. So the +2 damage from Goliath Gauntlet was meaningless. It was literally just a way to push a breakpoint.
Right, yeah.
Which is really good. But if it's just pushing a breakpoint, it might then be a better use case to gain just 1 additional life, and then prevent an opposing breakpoint.
Right, yeah.
So the Iron Rock Gauntlet crept up in a lot of lists there, and I was actually originally on Iron Rock. At some point, someone managed to convince me to get on Goliath, and I started playing that, and it still wasn't great. We were very happy to lose those later.
Yeah, makes sense. And then for the weapons, again, because you didn't have anything else, you had double Spider's Bite. Like, you could, the only other option you had was play Talishar. And I mean, Teleshar, if you're going for a long game, is just not a good option. So double Spider's Bite was kind of like the only option you had, really, even though it wasn't great, because you kind of don't want to attack with Spider's Bite twice in a
Mm-hmm.
turn. It's not really good, but yeah, it was
Yeah.
all that we had back then.
And for that reason, actually, because it wasn't very good to attack with Spider's Bite twice, there was actually a large group of people that were saying, hey, let's just be on a single dagger.
Right.
One dagger and then Arcane Lantern main board.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we were running, save the sideboard slot.
Right.
And I was also originally doing that as well, where I was just on one Spider's Bite, but someone managed to convince me that it was good enough to run the second dagger that you might as well.
Yeah.
For the sole reason of if you get to the point where a tempo lock can happen,
Right.
it's very important to have that second dagger. It was just not a very common occurrence in this deck
Right.
way back when. So I was convinced to run the second one because it did help out in those scenarios.
Right.
And it was worth more than having the extra sideboard slot, but it still wasn't great.
So kind of have
Double
like
dagger,
a very inefficient Kodachi lock basically in the late game, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, it was not great at all to be doing that.
Okay, so that takes care of the equipment, and then if we look at the sideboard real quick, the rest of the sideboard equipment is just AB3, that's it. You just have like Lantern, which makes sense, because as you said, you don't really want the second dagger anyways, and then you got boots and arms, which also makes sense. Arms, because you don't really have anything better, and then boots are just kind of like, you don't want to lose Tunic and you don't want to lose Mask, so Boots makes the most sense. So that's perfect. Okay, so let's go over the cards. And maybe we start by doing sort of like all of the contracts that are like rare or common in one go, because they all kind of work the same, right? Like all contracts that are currently in the game are templated the exact same way. It always says you're contracted to banish opponent cards. And then whenever you complete this contract, create a silver token. When this hits a hero, banish the top card of the deck. So the only thing that changes for these is what exactly you're supposed to banish. And then half of them, or roughly half of them, are 1-cost 5s, and the other half are 0-cost 4s. That's kind of like the only difference there. Yeah, so maybe we talk a little bit about what exactly made contracts good, what made them bad, and why specifically contracts kind of forced you into playing a specific playstyle with Arakni. Like, why was the hero playing the sort of deck that they were playing because of contracts specifically? So what's the idea behind that?
Yeah, so when you're looking at a contract card, there are 3 abilities on that thing. Well, actually, there are 4 things to talk about. The most important thing to talk about, which is the reason why you'll see contract cards in New or Azuri today, is that's a 0 for 4, and Annihilate the Armed is a 1 for 5. That is a premium stat line, it turns out, because the breakpoint there is actually really good. If you are playing a defensive deck and you're throwing a 0 for 3 with those stealth cards, it's not going to be very good. You are going to be losing that interaction because it can easily be blocked by 1 card. Plunder the Poor and Annihilate the Armed can't be blocked by 1 card unless they're running defense reactions. Or they're giving up their equipment, which both of those are, you're happy to see. And so when you're looking at that, the stat line is actually really important for these cards. Just because Wounding Blow and Critical Strike are a really good stat line. But then when you look at the abilities, you do have 3 actual abilities here. The first 2 written on the card, and the third written on the hero ability. And when you look at these together, the contract ability, when you banish an opponent's cards, you gain a silver token. When this hits a hero, you're going to banish the top card of their deck, which can then turn into a silver token. And when you play the card, you get to use Arachni's ability to Fate Seal and potentially change what you're banishing, which could increase your odds of getting a silver token. So they all work together in this very synergistic way. I love the design of contract cards in Arakni. It's a very cool design there. But when you're looking at these 3 abilities, it forces you to play a specific way. So let's say your opponent is on 60 cards, right? Let's just assume a simple 60, a tight 60 card deck there. They're running the 60, and you end the game in 6 turns. They get to see 24 cards of their deck, right? That means that there are 36 cards that they didn't see that just happen to be on the bottom of their deck. So let's start with just the on hit, banish the top card of their deck. If you are playing that 6-turn game with 24 cards being seen, you banish the top card of their deck. that means that 36 cards didn't get seen in that game because one of them got banished.
Mm-hmm.
There's no change there. Literally nothing. Maybe you banish a power card, but for all that the opposing player could have been aware, it was just in those bottom 36.
Yeah.
It didn't impact anything. And the same can be true of Arakni's hero ability. If you take a look at the top part of their deck and you put that on the bottom, well, yeah, that was on the bottom of their deck. They didn't get to see it.
Yeah.
So when you do these things, it's like, yes, you do have direct control to banish their deck, to look at their deck and manipulate it. But if the game is going only 6 turns and they're only seeing 24 cards, whoop-de-doo, you're getting nothing. And the same can even be said about the silver generation, because the only 2 outlets for silver are Mask of Perdition and Black-Tech Whisperers.
Yeah.
And when you look at those cards, if the game is lasting 6 turns, it doesn't matter how many cards you've banished off of Mask of Perdition, you're going to get nothing. And it doesn't matter how much go again you get off of Black-Tech Whispers, because you're not a super aggressive deck. You can't take advantage of it that much. So if the game is going quickly, those 3 abilities make it so that you're doing nothing in that quick game. So you have to make the game go slowly.
Yeah.
You have to slow down the game to be able to take advantage of all 3 of those abilities to their maximum benefits.
Yeah.
And that kind of justifies a lot of the decisions in the deck building process, where you were trying to make the game go slowly. There was, and this is something really funny that I've noticed throughout the history of Arakni, is whenever something new comes out for Arakni that makes players want to play the hero again, we'll get an influx of players and they will all try and do what we like to call the Christmas Land aggro deck, which is the funniest deck that you'll ever see. And it keeps popping up and people keep leaving it like a week later because it's not good.
It's not
The
good.
Christmas Land aggro deck is based on one very simple principle. If you play a contract card and then you give it go again and you play another contract card and that card hits, both contracts are going to be active. So if you have Plunder the Poor and Annihilate the Armed on the same combat chain and it hits and you banish, say, a head jab, it costs 1 or less, so it's going to trigger the Plunder the Poor contract. And it's an attack, so it's going to trigger the Annihilate the Armed contract. And there you go. You've just created 2 silvers. So people saw that interaction and they said, how can we get as much go again as possible to create as much silver as possible? Things like Lead the Charge, Raise a Reflex, even bigger than that, Captain's Call. And these are all not good cards. Because we can't play aggressively when you look at this card pool. It's giving up a whole card for go again does not make a whole ton of sense in the deck. And so because of that, that deck is not very good. And then for the exact reasons that I was just talking about earlier, if we're playing super aggressively, contract cards, all 3 of those abilities don't do anything. They just very low value out of being able to use those. So the Christmas Land aggro decks, as funny as they are, were not very good.
No. Like, I mean, generally, I think spending a card for go again historically has never been worth it in the history of Flesh and Blood. Like, none of these cards ever saw competitive play outside of specifically Runeblade. Like, Runeblade, or more specifically, Briar and Viserai were the only decks where you ever had cards that basically just said your next thing gets go again. So you had like Mavrian Skies in Viserai, you had Lead the Charge in Viserai, you had the same cards sometimes in Briar as well. Specifically because their hero abilities said you get some extra benefit out of playing a non-attack action. So if you're starting your turn as a Viserai with a Mavrian Skies, which also, adds an extra on hit, but for the most part, it was just played to get go again, right? And then your opponent has to block the next attack because it might generate some rune chance, but really it was mostly about chaining together attacks because that starter already gave you a rune chant when you played your next card. So you basically got 1 extra value out of just playing that card. Same thing for Briar. Playing something that gives your next attack go again basically means you only need to play another non-attack action to then make an embodiment of lightning. So kind of you can get half of a go again on top of getting go again. So it's just a good interaction. But those were historically the only decks where these cards were played and really made sense. And anytime somebody's tried it in Arakni or any other deck where you just go like, all right, maybe I can make this work and make this go aggro, sometimes it lines up and you just completely demolish somebody because you get to keep the tempo, and then those cards are pretty good. But the moment you're forced into trading cards, you start noticing that if I'm spending 3 cards to do like Annihilate the Armed into Plunder the Poor, I've just done like a 3-card 9 that had no disruption and maybe gave me like 2 silver, and then I can buy back an equipment. So maybe it's a 3-card 10 in a way. But like you said, the banishes don't really matter if you're racing this hard. And the opponent just goes like, right, my 3 cards can do like 12 or 13 damage, and your 3 cards do like 9 to 10 value maybe or something. So that's just inherently a lot worse, basically. And that's why these kind of lists never really saw any kind of success. On top of that, all of these go again enablers block 2. That's also an issue because most of them are generics and they just block 2. So that never really saw any kind of success, like even less than Arakni already did in the first place. So for the most part, just like you said, the combination of contracts and the hero ability of Arakni basically pushes you to play towards second cycle, because second cycle is when all of these things start to be relevant, basically. And that's kind of why the deck works the way it does, right? So yeah, that kind of takes care of the contracts themselves, right? Like I said, the abilities are all kind of the same. Mostly you play these for the banish, and then the silver generation is kind of like a little bit extra on the top. And you've actually made like a big old spreadsheet on Excel where you kind of like check the competitive decks that were viable in a specific meta, and you look through what are these decks actually playing, like how many non-attacks, how many attacks, etc., etc. And then you calculated which contracts were the best based on that. So what gives you the highest chance of actually making silver? And I think it turned out like Annihilate and Plunder were obvious, pretty much. And then I think it turned out the next best one, at least in the Dynasty era, was Slay the Scholars, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so it's actually super interesting. The consensus, you'll see this in this list and in the next one as well, is that Sack the Shifty was better.
Yep.
Because people were thinking that most non-attack actions had Go Again already, so you might as well use the Sack the Shifty to get the attacks that have Go Again in addition. But in Dusk Till Dawn, I made that data set, which took a look at this and actually crunched the numbers to figure out what was the best. And no matter how you weighted it, whether you weighted every hero individually, such that it didn't matter whether you were running against a Rhinar or at the time a Lexi, it didn't matter which one you were running into, or whether you weighted it like weighted, where you prioritized the Lexi because she was the best deck in the meta. It didn't matter how you weighted it. Slay the Scholars was just consistently 5 to 10% better than Sack the Shifty. And so when I put that data set together, everyone made that swap over from Sack the Shifty to Slay the Scholars. A couple people were already on Slay the Scholars. They were just had more foresight than the rest of us. But even back here in Dynasty, I think almost everyone was on Sack the Shifty.
I still remember that debate, and then like the spreadsheet just being like, hey, hang on, wait, this is like what actually is, if we done the math on that. It's interesting. So that was definitely like valuable data. And I think it could still be valuable if you updated it maybe one of these days. Because that's the issue. Like it takes a lot of work to do that, because you have to update it basically for every set, so it stays meta relevant. That's kind of the issue. And for example,
I don't think I've updated it since like Heavy Hitters.
I think in Heavy Hitters, for example, Rob the Rich kind of started creeping up a little bit, because you had all of these Brood decks playing a lot of 2 costs, so that kind of was a little bit better. And then generally, like the 1 cost contracts became a little bit more relevant, specifically because of Kasai and being easily able to block out a 0 for 4 through the use of Dynamo. So there's a little bit of like, meta shifts into what contracts are being played. But for the most part, it's just play a bunch of them. You don't really care that they make silver sometimes. Obviously, you're going to take the ones that make the most silver in that meta. But really, you're playing these for the banish and for the Arakni hero ability. That's kind of the main reason why you're playing them. Silver is just not the main focus of these cards.
Okay. Yeah, and that was actually like a consciousness shift, because early on, again, I was talking about how I've used the hero ability over time.
Yeah.
Back in Dynasty, silver was the most important thing about the cards.
Yeah.
And that's just not the case anymore. If we were to talk to literally any of the best Arachne players right now and ask them, hey, what's the primary purpose of the contract cards? Silver is at the bottom of the list.
Yeah, for sure.
It is less important than even the stat line. It's just an auxiliary benefit that you sometimes get to turn into other things.
Yeah. I think the part of the reason for that is that there isn't any kind of like really big payoff for silver in the game at the moment. That's kind of the thing. Like silver is nice to have, right? Because you can buy back these equipments and you get little points of extra value here and there, but there isn't like any flashy thing where you can go, right, I crack a whole bunch of silver at once and I get some big payoff for it, right? Not the way we have for gold. Like gold has a number of really nice payoffs that go along with it. You used to have like cash in, obviously, right, which has been banned because it was a little bit too good, to be honest. But cash in was the main one, right, that you had early, and technically that would have been playable in Arakni, but card draw historically hasn't been very good for Assassin just because the class doesn't have good ways to convert extra cards. We've talked about this before. You don't have easy access to go again. So drawing a bunch of extra cards in a lot of situations is just going to be forcing you to IP yourself, you know? So that was, I think, never run in Assassin outside of like these hyper aggro magical Christmas land lists that sometimes dabbled with it. But so there's like a lack of a good payoff for silver currently. And that's why sort of you don't really focus on it super hard.
Yeah, right. Yeah, 100%.
So that takes care of the common and rare contracts. So let's talk a little bit about the nicer ones, the majestic ones. And these were really like, these are the, I would say, the meat in any assassin deck, or it's specifically in early Dynasty Arakni. This is kind of the reason why you were playing this class, right? You wanted to get like Leave No Witnesses, you wanted to get Surgical Extraction because these just represent really good on hits. So it was a cycle. You had red, yellow, and blue. The red was Leave No Witnesses. And these two, like Leave No and Surgical Extraction, are in every single assassin deck ever. Like, doesn't matter which hero, Nu, Uzuri, Arakni, all of them play this. So Leave No Witnesses is basically just kind of like a budget CNC. It's a 0 for 4, banishes the opponent's arsenal, and then also the top card of the deck, you get some silver for red cards. Surgical Extraction, probably one of the best on-hits in the entire game. You just look at your opponent's hand, and you can take any card from that and just banish it, which is fantastic disruption. Like, hand disruption is super powerful, and targeted hand disruption like this, where you get to choose what to take, is just really devastating a lot of the time.
Yeah, and it's even better for Surgical because Surgical's contract is looking for blue cards, and a vast majority of the time when you look at their hand and banish a card, the best card to banish is the blue card.
Yep.
Because every deck needs resources, and if you can eat those resources, you're coming out ahead.
Yep, absolutely, yeah. So yeah, those are those two. You have like direct disruption on these, and that's why they're run in other assassin decks. Like Nu and Uzuri mostly don't care about the banish and mostly don't care about the silver. They just play these because they have disruption tacked onto them. That's the main reason. Like, now, sometimes the silver is nice, sometimes the banishes are nice, but for the most part you play these because they actively disrupt your opponent's next turn. That's what you're doing with them.
Yeah, and they come with that incredibly important stat line of the wounded blow and the 4 break point is just, it's such a premium in the other heroes because stealths are the 0 for 3 stat line. They're disruption on a really good stat line.
Yeah, absolutely, and then we have Eradicate, the third one, and sort of like the odd one out because it doesn't immediately disrupt, and that kind of makes it a little bit weird, and that's also why it's not commonly played in other assassin decks unless they're leaning into the fatigue angle pretty heavily. So I think arguably for Arakni, this is actually the most important one of the 3.
Yeah, that's the strongest card in the list you're looking at right there, and it's not even close. Eradicate is the only reason that we were able to win games back in Dynasty. Obviously, nowadays we've got a lot of better, different tools that we can use. We aren't relying solely on Eradicate to hit, but back then, Eradicate was how we won games. Because if you're not banishing a lot of cards from deck, if you're only presenting 1 deck banish per turn from the rest of the contracts, maybe 2 whenever you get your Mask of Perdition off, that's just too slow of a rate. But if I present an Eradicate and I buff it with 2 Cut to the Chases,
Yeah.
man, that's going to banish a lot of cards, and that is going to win me the game. Because then when you banish that many cards, you basically just get to completely pivot your game plan and say, all right, I'm doing nothing else but blocking now, and I'm going to win because they're going to run other cards first.
Yep.
It is such a good card. It in fact even spawned a couple of, you could call them meme builds, where you were playing like the potions to
Potion
buff
of
it up.
Strength, yeah.
I know Archon Altars was really into that type of list. He even did that. I think he did that as recently as like Heavy Hitters. He was doing something similar, but
yeah, like he always dabbles in potion lists. It's kind of like his pet thing is playing like potions and just doing silly things with them. I do think he got off like an Eradicate for like 21 or something once. I remember a screenshot of that floating around. But that's obviously not something that's gonna happen like every game or even like once every 5 games. You know, that's something that you record that for a video and then you just go like, hey, Eradicate is broken, Arakni is the best hero in the game. And then everybody tries it and they found out, no, that's actually not the case. You just got really
turns
lucky.
out potions don't block and you have to use your action point to put them into play. So
it's kind of rough. So but yeah, Eradicate is very good if your main game plan is fatigue. And I think any opponent that has ever gotten like 10 cards eaten by a buffed Eradicate is going to be very careful about not blocking this card. So
exactly. It's just the strongest card that this deck was running.
Yep, makes sense. All right,
and that brings us directly into the Cut to the Chase and the Shred there, because they
support
the primary. They buff up Eradicate. You block it, you shred the block. They don't block it, you buff it up with Cut to the Chase. Those cards existed primarily to allow Eradicate to be better. Obviously, you can run Cut to the Chase and Shred and make a Leave No Witnesses or a Surgical Extraction hit. But primarily, the use case was because Eradicate was so good, because that was the main way we were winning. You wanted to save those Cut to the Chases for Eradicate. And that's still the case to this day. The best use case of your Cut to the Chase is on an Eradicate, even though we're not running the Shreds most of the time, and even though we're not running the Cut to the Chase, which that yellow Cut to the Chase does not show up ever again. We were exclusively running that because we didn't have better options in the list, which, early days Dynasty is funny.
That was just Dynasty giving us not a whole lot of cards to actually work with.
Yeah, probably the worst card in the deck right there is that yellow Cut to the Chase, but we didn't have anything better to do.
Fair.
The primary use case of them was to buff the Eradicate, but the moment that I could take out yellow Cut to the Chase and the moment that I could take out Shred, I did, for just a variety of reasons. I've never been a big fan of Shred. Yellow Cut to the Chase was just bad, but that red, you'll see that all the time. 0 for +3 is just a really good reaction.
It's one of the main kind of like extenders that Arakni actually has access to, where you can just convert a card to like extra damage without being super below rate. So yeah, it's good in that way, and it still blocks 3. So like block 3 reactions are like low-key some of the best cards in the game, because there's a lot of things that kind of trigger off of attacking, like blocking with actions or blocking with attack actions specifically. There's a lot of things that care about that, and if you block with a reaction, you're just always good to go. Like nothing really cares about that. So that's great. A great stat line to have on a card basically is block 3 on any kind of reaction is always good. Okay,
but let's talk a little bit more about Shred actually, because that is one of the more interesting cards in this list, because I said earlier that when I could remove it, I did. The moment that I could get it out of my list, I wanted it out of my list, because this is one of the strongest portable cards in the game. It is really good to be able to look at your opponent and say, your block didn't matter. But it also does functionally nothing if your opponent doesn't block. And if you present to Leave No Witnesses, you've got a yellow Shred in your hand, and your opponent chooses not to block. They're just like, all right, I'll eat it. What do you do with that Shred? Do you just put it in your arsenal? Well, if you do that, now you don't have an arsenal until your opponent decides to block something. Which in those kind of matchups, maybe they never will. It is such a large condition that at first glance, it doesn't look like a heavy condition to me, but it is such an impactful condition that Shred is probably one of the weaker attack reactions that Assassin has access to. just because of that condition you have to jump through. The yellows and blues were better because you could also pitch them to
Yep.
dagger or to attack with other things.
Yep.
And that's why they remained in the list for as long as they did, because
Yep.
you can just pitch them if you need to. And then sometimes they've got that fringe utility, but when we started getting a better blue base, I took them out the first moment that I could.
Yep.
It's just
makes
not as
sense.
good.
Like,
Mhm.
I think don't arsenal shred has been one of like the most consistent pieces of advice that is given to like newer assassin players specifically. I remember that being like constantly telling that to people in Uzuri basically, where because Uzuri also ran shred, right? And specifically Uzuri also had a better way of utilizing shred because she could kind of use shred on stuff like a CNC. If you go like stealth card, swap, and then you use the shred on the stealth card before the swap resolves, you still get the -3, and that persists through the swap. So you could functionally shred something like a CNC sometimes, which was pretty neat. But even in Uzuri, don't arsenal shred was like one of the main things that we told people, just because it could clunk up your arsenal so much, and it was so bad when that happened, and you were sitting on that shred for like 2 to 3 turns, and you couldn't play efficiently just because you had it stuck in arsenal. So yeah, definitely a thing to keep in mind with this card is like just try to not get it stuck in arsenal because it really hurts. Okay, so that kind of takes care of the contracts and also kind of like the cards that support the contracts in the form of these
Yeah, that basically takes care of all of the assassin cards in the early.
Basically all of the assassin cards we had access to in Dynasty, with the exception of like Payday and what else? There was something. Regicide. Yeah, I keep forgetting about Regicide. The only card in the game that makes your deck worse by just including it, probably. Yeah.
It's such a bad card.
Like actively makes your deck worse. It's kind of like it's a sad excuse for a specialization, unfortunately. Very cool card really flavor wise, but yeah, as an actual game piece, it just kind of isn't great, unfortunately. Yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the generics here, and this should be a little bit quicker because we have Command and Conquer, which is just great card, all-time staple, has been in basically every deck that has been made ever since Arcane Rising. It's just an awesome card, specifically if you're trying to prolong the game, drag out the game. Having disruptive pieces that come with a good stat line is really important. Because you can just go like 2 cards CNC, the opponent kind of has to block it if they have an arsenal. Great card to have. It's just all around good. It's also a popper, which was
really good.
Sometimes the only reason it was in lists, like 5, for example, basically played CNC because it was a popper and it was just better than other poppers that you could play. But yeah. Then we have the D-Reacts, and I think these are also pretty easy to cover. Fate Foreseen and Sink Below. 0 for 4 blocks with upsides that you can use against decks that try to do dominate shenanigans. Like Bravo was still playable back then. Azalea was also kind of present. Not really back then because that was before Outsiders, and she was perceived to be one of the weaker decks in the game, and definitely kind of was at that point. But still you sometimes ran into one, and against other decks it was just you wanted to block a couple of cards every turn anyways, because that was kind of your game plan, and then blocking with an extra card was also kind of good.
Yeah, it's good, but it's not the primary reason that Arakni, at least in my opinion, that Arakni was running those cards. The difference between 3 block and a 4 block at reaction speed is it's good. It's definitely not unnoticeable, but the big thing with Fate Foreseen and Sink Below, and that we'll also talk about again with Enlightened Strike, is that those 3 cards are able to put a red card on the bottom of your deck. And if you are going slow, you're going into the second cycle, you're going into the third cycle, a red card on the bottom of your deck is worth way more than a red card right now. A Leave No Witnesses at the end of the game when your opponent has no armor, when your opponent is trying to save something to close out the game, is way stronger than a Leave No Witnesses when your opponent can just tank it with armor block or just not respect you and just say, all right, I'll lose an okay card. Being able to use Fate Foreseen, Sink Below, and E-Strike to put that card on bottom, that was the primary use case of those cards. And That's still the primary use case of Enlightened Strike, and honestly, it's still probably even the primary use case of Sink Below.
Okay.
Fate Foreseen, you had to get lucky to be able to do that with the Oct, but it was still
Yeah.
like that's what you were looking for.
It's kind of
That's what you were trying
random,
to do.
but yeah, that's kind of what you
Mhm.
were doing with it. Yeah. And it hides that information from the opponent too. You know, that's even better. Sometimes you can just like pitch a red to something like Annihilate the Arm, and it's okay. But then the opponent
Mhm.
knows it's there, right? Like with Sink Below and E Strike, they never know you actually put a red card on the bottom, and it can kind of surprise them. Like, imagine putting a Cut to the Chase on the bottom of the deck, and they never see that Cut to the Chase during the game, and then in the late game you play out like a Leave No Witnesses or something, and they have to think about, or an Eradicate, they have to think about, is there still a Cut to the Chase somewhere? Is that something that I have to respect at this point? Yeah, makes sense.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, very good utility
yeah,
there.
and
And
that also coincidentally kind of covers what Enlightened Strike is doing here.
mhm.
It's putting cards on the bottom, and apart from that, it's just a really versatile game piece, right? Like you can just use it as an extender if you have to. If you have tempo for some reason, you can use it to go a bit taller, hit for 7, draw a card sometimes, maybe to just do like a 2-card play that still resets your arsenal, stuff like that. So just a flexible
Yeah,
card.
E-Strike is probably my favorite card in the game. Just
Yeah.
the flexibility of it is really good.
Yep.
It helps the fatigue games where you're putting a red card on bottom for the
Mhm.
same thing as Sink Below and Fate Foreseen, but it's also just like a really versatile, flexible attack there. We were talking earlier about how Arakni can't really go super aggressive,
Yep.
and Enlightened Strike helps to shore up some of the
Mhm.
problems with that
Yeah.
because you can just make it a 2-card 5 go again.
Yep.
Which is just good. That is ways that we are able to beat certain decks is
Yep.
because of Enlightened Strike.
Yep.
Um,
It's not super
it-
efficient in terms of attacks with go again,
Mhm.
but it's kind of like one of the better ones that we have access to in Assassin. Yeah.
Yeah, I doubt it will ever leave Arachne's lists ever.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just such a good card in the
Yep.
list.
Just really flexible. Yeah. Okay, and then finally we have a couple of blues, and we have Sigil of Solace. So Sigil is probably one of my favorite cards in the game while we're talking about favorites, but that's specifically from like the point of view of Uzuri, where this card was just like really good to bluff with, right? You just send a stealth card and you keep a sigil, and they have to think, is this like a 6-power attack? Do I have to block it? If you block it, you put it into arsenal, and sigil in arsenal is one of the best things you can have. I would say sigil is probably one of the best cards you can have in your arsenal. It's just so powerful, because if the opponent sends like a CNC at you, you just go like, all right, take 3, I don't care. Effectively, right? The disruption isn't live, you just take 3 damage from it, and there's so many things you can do with a sigil in arsenal. It's really good. I imagine in Arakni it was more of like all right, I'm playing a defensive grindy list, and this is life gain, so it kind of helps with that game plan, and that's kind of what I'm doing with this, not necessarily a bluffing tool as much.
Yeah, Sigil was the best turn 0 play that we had. But in my opinion, actually, as I think back on these lists, as I was putting these decks together and really looking back at what I was doing back then, I view Sigil of Solace as a crutch that I leaned on. And I personally, I regret having it in my list.
Okay.
Because I relied on the life gain to shore up some matchups that I should have been better into without the life gain.
Okay.
It made it so that I didn't have to learn a lot of the direct fundamentals like pitch stacking, reverse pitch stacking, all of the really strong things that I now see as like the primary reason you're playing Arachne.
Yeah.
Sigil of Solace made it so that you didn't have to think about that as much because the gain 3 life is just, as you said, it's really good.
Yeah.
But it was definitely, in my opinion, more of a crutch that
Okay.
I should not have relied on, and I'm very happy that it's not in my list anymore
Okay.
because I don't have to rely on that life gain crutch.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And we'll see when it does get taken out of the list later on, but it's no longer in there. I'm very glad it's not. It's one of those cards that was just, it shouldn't have been in there in the first place. It was too much of a crutch.
All right. Makes sense. Yeah. Okay, and then the last 2 I think are just kind of again examples of we didn't have anything better. So you have This Rounds on Me, which is like a blue block 3, and sometimes you can play it and the ability is kind of relevant, but mostly
Yeah.
you're giving the opponent an extra card and you're drawing an extra card, which has a decent chance of not being something that you can really utilize because assassin things, that's kind of how the hero works, unfortunately. Random card draw in assassin is not very good most of the time. And then unmovable, I guess, is also just like, all right, sometimes it's like a way to 2 cards, block 6 with a blue. Maybe they have dominate or something, and it's kind of relevant. So
yeah, they were both good cards, but they're definitely relics of the fact that we didn't have very much else that we could be doing.
Makes sense.
This Rounds on Me was really good in Defy and Katsu, but we were already pretty good in Defy and Katsu without it. Unmovable was, as you said, good into Bravo and Dorinthia at the time, and we weren't really very good into them, but sometimes the blue block 6 was worth it. But it just wasn't. They're relics of the time.
Right.
The best way to put
Makes
them.
sense, yeah. Okay, and then we have a couple of cards in the sideboard. The shreds we already talked about. Also, why the red shred is in the sideboard and not the main board. That makes perfect sense in my opinion. It's like the red is kind of the worst shred, basically, right? You just wanted more shreds, but the red one is just the least flexible one. And the fact that it's technically above rate, because it gives a -4, is just very rarely relevant because there aren't that many single cards in the game that actually block for 4 or more. So it was basically just a bunch of D-reacts, and sometimes you got lucky and you could snipe one of those with it. And then occasionally it was Husk. And that's kind of like the only use cases you had for this, were like Husk and then sometimes D-reacts. And most of the time it was functionally just 2 extra copies of Yellow Shred. That's kind of how that went.
Yeah, not a great card there. Also is not going to be seen again. Unmovable, against Bravo and Dorinthia at the time. Specifically though Bravo, because we had such a bad matchup into Bravo. Thankfully we don't need to run that anymore because that hero doesn't really exist.
Doesn't really exist at the moment. Poor Bravo.
And then you've got unfortunate for Bravo. We got Fiendo's Fighting Spirit as a popper, the best popper that we have, because we always had a really bad matchup into heroes like Dromai and Prism.
For sure.
Which I think Prism was around for a bit of Dynasty there. So
I think at the very start of it,
yeah, I think so. I want to say so. And then you had the Remembrance as just a. This is a card I hate. I know you dislike it as well.
It's probably my least favorite card in the game.
It creates a game loop that is not very enjoyable for either player. It creates a way to play the game that should not exist by just allowing you to put your cards back and shuffle your deck and redo anything you need there. Just reorganize your stacks. It was used because getting poppers back against things like Dromai was just that important. And then sometimes you can also use it to get Enlightened Strikes back if you need to be aggressive and need the tempo. But it was not a very fun card to be playing.
No.
We just had to play it.
I still remember like this kind of weird Remembrance arms race that Oldhim introduced to the game, where like Oldhim started running Remembrance and then other decks had to run even more Remembrance to counter it, and then Oldhim started running more Remembrance, and eventually it was just kind of like this weird, how many Remembrance did you register, and the deck with more of them kind of won, and that was just like a really not enjoyable state of the game. I always kind of kept hoping they would ban this card, not because it's too powerful, but just because it creates inherently gameplay scenarios that are just not really enjoyable for either player. So I don't know. So far they haven't banned it, and maybe they don't see the need to because it hasn't been in lists in basically since Oldhim left. Nobody has been running Remembrance. And so far we haven't had a hero that was as problematic as Oldhim in that regard. So we'll come back to
maybe we'll see it with Jarl, but
could be possibly. I don't think that he's gonna be as crazy defensive as Oldhim was, simply because he doesn't have Chrono Seeds to begin with. I think that's a big reason for it. But yeah, there's currently another card in the game that is similar, and we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah,
once we get
that's
to
an elephant in the room that we'll
very
get
big
to later
elephant.
on.
Is specifically in light of recent events, that's a very big elephant in the room. Yes.
Yeah, I was
um,
looking at that this morning before we hopped
yeah,
on this.
yeah. Same.
Mhm,
Not
mhm.
really very pumped to have seen that, but maybe it means it won't be an issue for much longer. So let's see.
Yeah,
But we'll get
hopefully,
to that. And
hopefully.
then the last one we have is that all you got, which I imagine is just I think at the time you had a lot of like Fi and Katsu running around.
Yeah,
So
specifically in my local environment, we had a
right.
lot of ninjas.
Okay.
We stopped seeing those ninjas actually around Part the Mistveil, which was really
Mhm.
weird because that's not the set that you'd expect to stop seeing ninjas. We still
That's
got the
true.
occasional Zen there.
That's kind of true.
Um,
Yeah. They should just
but
switch over to Zen, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, actually, it was really, really weird. All of our ninja players, because we had a lot of them, but they saw Zen and they were like, no, I'm just going to stick with Fi and Katsu. And
Hmm.
then some of them were like, wait, but what if I tried some of the other heroes instead? And then
Right.
we didn't really get very much Zen
Huh.
at all. I managed to
Interesting.
escape that here at my locals. But
Yeah. Lucky you.
yeah, lucky me here. But until then, up until that point, there was a lot of ninja. So you'll see a lot of ninja tech cards
Right.
all
Okay.
over the place in my sideboard,
Makes sense.
just because that was what was in my locals.
Okay.
And that all you got mostly existed to
Yeah.
combat
It's a
those.
good card
Mm,
against ninjas. Yeah. That's true.
yeah,
Also
very
against
good.
assassin, ironically.
Yeah, really good
Specifically,
against
yeah,
assassin.
it's good against like daggers. If you just want to block daggers for free, this is a great card to do that. Yeah.
And we'll touch on that a little bit later as well.
Hmm.
We'll touch on the going against that all you got
Yep.
actually,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
super interesting.
Okay, so yeah, this takes care of like the base
Hmm.
building blocks of the deck, basically. So this was Dynasty era Arachne. As you
Yeah.
can see
And
by
for
some of the
anyone keeping track at home, this was a 2-year-old list.
yeah,
Dynasty was like 2 years ago.
yep,
So this is, you can see the age of this list
yeah.
just looking at it.
Based
And
on
it's
like some
crazy
of the
how far
card
we've come.
choices, just you had to run
Hmm.
these cards because everything else you had was even worse, basically. Um,
Exactly.
and we'll start to see some of these cards disappear as we move forward. So let's switch over to Outsiders, which was like
Hmm.
we had Dynasty, and then immediately after the next set was Outsiders, which again had an assassin in it in the form of Azuri, and kind of really
Hmm.
fleshed out some of the missing pieces that you had. Um,
Hmm.
we see that in the equipment slot, so we see Goliath Gauntlet disappear, and we see the
Thank
double
goodness.
Spider's Bite disappear. So we had extra
Thank goodness.
daggers in Outsiders, and we had flick knives. And
Hmm.
let's talk about that for a little bit. What's your feeling on flick knives specifically for Arachne? Because for Azuri, this card was great. Basically, flick knives just said,
Hmm.
"Hey, your opponent starts at 2 less life total than they normally would, so they can never go to 2 against you." Because once they go to 2, you just have to survive for 2 turns and they're dead no matter what.
Yeah. So Flick Knives is really good. When you look at this equipment suite of Black Tech Whispers, Flick Knives, Spring Tunic, and Mask of Perdition, that remains unchanged
Yeah.
from Outsiders to today. That the letter of the cards that you're running in your deck does not change.
Yeah.
But what is super interesting is all three of those assassin cards are now used in a completely different manner today than they were back then. And we've already talked about how Black Tech Whispers and Mask of Perdition were used around this time.
Yeah.
And those are still used in the exact same way in Outsiders. They don't change until actually Part the Mistveil.
Yeah.
So we'll get to how their use case is when we get there.
Mm-hmm.
Flick Knives, at this point, we just got it. The use case in Outsiders is specifically used right there with that nerve scalpel.
Yep.
And so you can't talk about Flick Knives without talking about nerve scalpel.
Yep.
The interaction is really cool. The amount of times that I've had to explain this interaction back when I was playing
Yep.
this is unreasonable,
I
I'll
feel
say.
you, yeah, definitely.
Is a little bit too complicated of an interaction. But the way it worked is, let's say I present a Leave No Witnesses. My opponent wants to keep their arsenal, so they're going to defend with a Sink Below, right?
Mm-hmm.
Leave No Witnesses is coming in for 4. Sink Below is going to block for 4. They play the Sink Below. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
Sink Below has not resolved. It has not become a defending card yet. So what you'll do is you will activate Flick Knives,
Yep.
which will have your Nerve Scalpel deal 1 damage to the opponent. The Nerve Scalpel will then hit.
Mm-hmm.
So the Nerve Scalpel, Flick Knives will resolve. The next time the defending hero defends with the reaction, it's going to have -1 block. Now remember, that Sink Below has not resolved yet. It is not a defending card.
Yep.
So the Nerve Scalpel will hit before the Sink Below becomes a defending card, so that when the Sink Below resolves, it is now going to have -1 block,
Yep.
and it is going to be blocking for 3. But what makes it super difficult and frustrating is, let's say they're already blocking with it's an Assassin Mirror, and they're blocking with a Cut to the Chase.
Yep.
That's an attack reaction. Well, the Nerve Scalpel hit is not going to impact that. That's
Yep.
still blocking for 3.
Yeah.
It's not going to retroactively apply. And then let's say somehow I've buffed up my Leave No Witnesses to be coming in for 8, and my opponent is sending 2 Sink Belows.
Yeah.
And before both of them resolves, I hit with the Flick Knives Nerve Scalpel. It's going to reduce one of those down to 3, but the other one's still going to be blocking for 4. It's only going to impact one of those. Yeah. So there's a lot of really interesting edge cases around Nerve Scalpel and how it works with Flick Knives, and it's one of the less intuitive things about this deck.
For sure.
But it is probably the most important thing that you were getting out of Flick Knives.
Yep.
Now, in retrospect, I disagree with what we were doing with Flick Knives. I think it was a bad idea to be doing this because of we really like having 2 daggers out right now. Being able to dagger attack allows you to pitch stack really easily thanks to the 4 cost there. And back during Outsiders, we were kind of treating that Nerve Scalpel as a once per game hit an attack defense reaction button, which is good. But when you do that, once you click that button, now you only have a single dagger, which is going to make that pitch stacking substantially more difficult. But also that comes with my skill level. Back in Outsiders, I wasn't really pitch stacking. I didn't know how to do that to the effect that I do now. And so it didn't matter to me whether I was losing a dagger or not. That's 100% not the case anymore. If I were playing this exact version of the deck today, I would be treating Flick Knives essentially as a way to, I'm going to reduce your life total by 2 at the start of the game, or more accurately at the end of the game, and tempo lock you earlier. And then maybe once in a blue moon, I might throw that Nerve Scalpel, but I probably won't ever do that. Okay. It's just like a threat that I can do that if you want.
The threat of having it and making the opponent think about it is usually more potent than actually doing it. Yeah, that's the case for a lot of equipment pieces. You know, you also see that with a Rousing Wave in New, where actually not cashing that in is usually like more relevant, to the point where the first one I usually cash in for like a Bonds of Agony is usually the boots, just so I have a Rousing Wave up for longer, because it's generally the more impactful one of the 2. So generally just having this way of saying, right, you will block for 1 less whenever I choose so, and the opponent has to kind of play around that is it's really interesting. Like, it's a very, very skill intensive thing, and you can really tell a lot about the skill level of a player, of how they play around Nerve Scalpel, when they're going to use it. Opponents can also offer the trade where they just go like, all right, here's my Sink Below on your Leave No Witnesses while I have an arsenal. Do you want to give me your Nerve Scalpel on like turn 3? And then if you take that trade, usually it's detrimental to you, even if you come out ahead in that 1 turn cycle. So it's kind of like a very, very interesting skill cap test, basically, of how you play around this. Really neat interaction. But yeah, it is still better than Goliath Gauntlet. So
substantially better than Goliath Gauntlet and Iron Rock Gauntlet. Though, interestingly, on release, there was a debate on, wait, so are we actually running Flick Knives, or are we just going to put that aside and still run Goliath Gauntlet? Because there were some people that were saying, Command and Conquer for 8 is pretty good. We might as well just do that.
I mean, you can't argue with that. Command and Conquer for 8 is pretty good. That's not wrong.
You can't argue with it at all. Those voices lost out in the end because Flick Knives, Nerve Scalpel, as we learned more about how to do that. And then, more importantly, the tempo locking at the end was just, you got to run Flick Knives. It's just a really good assassin piece.
It's a good piece of equipment. Yeah, I like it. It's a very, very nice piece of gear. All right, so and then we already talked about Nerve Scalpel, why that's in the list and not one of the others. So because Outsiders also gave us Orbitoclast and Scale Peeler, and I think Orbitoclast was always kind of like the ugly duckling of those 4. Like, nobody ever really seriously ran that card outside of like I guess if you had like a big proliferation of like Kanos in your locals, then maybe it was worth, taking and putting it into your list. But for the most part, people just kind of skip that. Scale Peeler did saw use, specifically any time in metas where you had like decks with a lot of fridge. And
Hmm.
certainly anytime you had Dynamo Warrior decks around, because it's one of the best tools against those. I also remember Scale Peeler being in lists specifically because of Oldhim. So
Hmm.
you had like Scale Peeler and Vambrace of Determination to kind of counter the combination of Crown of Seeds and Rampart of the Ram's Head. That was the thing
Yep.
that people were doing back then. Didn't mean that you had good chances into Oldhim on Assassin, but it kind of made the matchup somewhat playable at least.
Yeah.
So that was a good combination of cards. I think that was also kind of the only time Plague Hive was actively played in lists, was during the Oldhim
Hmm.
days, as specifically like a counter to Oldhim, where you could expect to see Plague Hive maybe be used 2 or even 3 times if the game went long enough. And if you hit like Blood Rot every single time, you usually got enough value out of it to make it worth running. But yeah, fortunately, that's a deck we don't have to deal with anymore. So
Very fortunately, very
yeah.
fortunately. I'll say I've never been the biggest fan of Scale Peeler outside of those two very specific matchups, Dynamos and Oldhim. As far as the Oldhim matchup was concerned, it was a lost cause no matter what, so I didn't bother bringing in the tech against it, including
That's
Plague
fair.
Hive. I didn't bring that card in at all. Um, then against the Dynamos, though, it's such a niche card that you're not going to run into it very often.
Yeah.
I only ran Scale Peeler during one specific meta where you might run into it, and maybe I'll be running it again starting in the Hunted with the new Dagger Warrior,
Dagger
because they
Warrior,
might
yeah.
be running Dynamos into that as well. But outside of those metas, I wasn't really running Scale Peeler because of the very simple idea that, yeah, I can attempt to present Scale Peeler every turn, but there is going to be a turn that I'm going to miss.
Yep.
They're going to just throw their armor during that. They're going to find ways to get it in. And so
Yeah.
I might as well just be running daggers that will do more impact than the Scale Peeler.
Makes
Because
sense, yeah.
I'm making the game go long enough, they're going to find a way to push it in, and it's going to mess up my day, and I'm going to be upset about it. Might as
Yeah.
well just play around the knowledge that they are going to do that
Yeah.
and run daggers that are going to have more impact on the game, the turn-to-turn state of the game,
Yeah.
like Spider's Bite and Nerve Scalpel.
Yeah. No, I get that. That makes sense, yeah.
Mhm.
So, all right. Takes care of the equipment, and I think in the sideboard that hasn't changed in terms of equipment. Still AB3, so no changes
Mhm.
there. Still the same
And still,
AB3 specifically. So
mhm.
lantern, gloves, and boots. And if we go over the deck, also not a whole lot has changed. You can see that some of the, like, I would say extraneous blues in the form of like This Rounds on Me is gone, exactly.
Mhm.
And the yellow Cut to the Chases are gone, and they have been replaced with a singleton copy of Death Touch
Very
and
good card.
Codex of Frailty. And mostly, I guess Death Touch is in here because of Codex of Frailty, because it's just a
Yes.
very good target for Codex of Frailty.
Yeah, Codex of Frailty. We don't need to talk about it too much because everyone probably already knows about it.
Yes, it's
It's one
like
of the best
12
cards
million
in
points
the
of
game.
value.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, Arachne does use it a little differently than the other assassins.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about this earlier, in that Arachne, in the other assassins, you are using Codex of Frailty primarily to do like Leave No Witnesses plays.
Yep.
Because if you play Codex, get the Leave No Witness back, your opponent gets a card back,
Yep.
but then you send the Leave No Witnesses to hit that card and disrupt it. But Arachne, though, because of how important it is for us to keep our deck nice and fat, because we're playing Fatigue, we want to be keeping cards in the deck. If you're just Codex of Frailty into Leave No Witnesses, you are going to be losing that interaction.
Yeah.
So it's always a better idea to go like Dagger, Codex of Frailty into a Command and Conquer.
Yep.
And then every once in a while, maybe you'll do a Codex into a Death Touch, because the disruption that is present in Death Touch can be really good, and sometimes a 1-for-8 can just win the game.
Yep.
But you're mostly using Codex for Command and Conquer, and I would almost rather never bring back a Leave No Witnesses if I can avoid it, because I want to keep those cards in deck.
I think it depends kind of like, I mean, obviously, Codex with CNC is a play that I love to do on other assassins as well, but it kind of depends on the game state if you're able to actually do that, or if it's something like usually it has to line up with a tunic counter being ready, so you can go like dagger into CNC, and that's a pretty good line usually.
Which, if it doesn't line up in Arakni, I'm going to be pitching that codex. I prioritize the Command and Conquer so much that I'm setting that codex up for later instead.
Okay, yeah, I mean that makes sense, because in Arakni you have this like knowledge that you're going to second cycle, because that is your primary game plan anyways. So you might as well just pitch the codex. Whereas if I'm playing Uzuri or Nu, and I'm not in a matchup where I need to go to fatigue, which is the most matchups realistically, I know if I'm pitching a codex, I'm probably not seeing that codex again. So I'm a little hesitant to do that unless it's like super early. Like if I draw a codex in my like opening hand or something, yeah, I'm pitching it because it's not going to do anything. But for the most part, I'm trying to kind of find spaces to utilize those codexes. Maybe get them to Arsenal and then block with a CNC, and then I'm still able to play that, something like that. But yeah, in Arakni, because you're just going to second cycle anyways in basically every matchup, it makes sense to pitch your codexes because they're gonna be more impactful later in the game anyways. Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, I never have to rely on, oh man, I wish this lined up with a tunic counter. I'm just gonna pitch it if it doesn't. And
just pitch
even if it does line up,
yeah,
I might still pitch it because a codex later is worth way more than a codex now.
Okay, makes sense, yeah. All right, and then if you go into the sideboard here, we can see the red shreds have also gone. That's now out of the list. We just have like blues and yellows left. Unfortunately, still a single remembrance here. The Finals Fighting Spirit has been replaced by Down and Dirty, which is just, if you were specifically looking at Dromai as, I think at that point, the only illusionist in the game, Down and Dirty is just way better. No questions asked, because you can arsenal it, and then you still have a popper available, and that's really impactful. And then we have that all you got was replaced by Frailty Traps, which makes sense because this was Lexi meta for the most part.
Oh yeah. Frailty Trap is just one of the best defense reactions we have access to. I'd rather run that over Sink Below and Fate Foreseen if I was able to.
Yeah.
It doesn't work as good into every matchup, so it's always going to be a sideboard card.
Yeah.
But it is just a really good defense reaction. Specifically, as you mentioned, in this meta against Lexi, it was really, really good because you could play that for like 8 defense.
Sometimes, like if it lined up that well, usually it was, but it was at minimum it was worth like 5 against Alexi. That was like the baseline, and that's kind of crazy. Like a card that's worth 5 on the defense, of course you're gonna play that, and then frequently it lined up to be worth like 6 or even 7 sometimes. So
and then sometimes even more than that. If you can put that in front of a Bolton shot and turn it off, that's just one of the best feelings.
Yeah, and it just ends their turn because they don't have go again anymore. That's really powerful, I've unfortunately never made that happen in like a paper play. Despite playing a lot against Lexi, that just kind of never lined up, but it's definitely a thing that was possible, And then we have Give and Take here.
Exclusively for Dromai. It's a 1 cost 3 attack go again. The rest of it doesn't matter.
Okay.
There's a fringe utility that I never actually managed to do that is always talked about. It's always super interesting in Give and Take locks. Never managed to pull it off, but it's super interesting what you can do with Give and Takes and Codex of Frailty together when your opponent is forced to block it.
I think maybe the reason why that doesn't line up in Arakni that much is because the opponent has to be on really low life totals for that to happen. And with Arakni, that game state just doesn't really exist a lot of the time. I have pulled that off against a Bravo once at a Pro Quest on Uzuri, where I got them to like, I think 3 or 4 life, and I had Flick Knife still up. So if they went to 1, it would have been game over. So they had to block Give and Take. And then I was able to just loop it. Like they block Give and Take, I put a Codex on top. Next turn, I do it all over again. So every single turn, you're just attacking with Give and Take. They have to block it, and you just keep recycling Give and Take or Codex of Frailty. And eventually they just lose because they have to keep blocking it, and you can just do it all over again without losing cards from deck. It's a really powerful anti-fatigue tool in that way, but it's very hard to line up for it to actually happen.
Yeah, by the time we actually were able to start taking advantage of give and take, by the time we had the damage numbers to be
Mm-hmm.
able to get people into a tempo lock
Mm-hmm.
situation, we already had better things to be doing with it that didn't require as much deck space.
Yeah.
So while give and take would definitely come into some matchups, if we ran into matchups where we need it, it 100% warrants the slot for that interaction to be able to
Mm-hmm.
tempo lock with it. But there are not enough matchups right now that require you
Yeah.
to use give and take to tempo lock because
Yep.
we have better tools available right
Yep.
now.
Makes sense. Yeah. And then
Mhm.
lastly, we have Oasis Respite, which I assume was basically just a meta call because you had like more
Yeah.
wizards around or something like that at the time.
Yeah, Oasis or Spite will just pop in and out of the list
Mm-hmm.
as seemingly at random.
Mm-hmm.
There's no rhyme or reason for it. It just sometimes shows up and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay. Right.
Um,
It's
it's always I always give the excuse of yeah, it's based on the meta. No, I kind of just don't know when to bring in Oasis. This is not like I know
fair.
which matchups to bring it into, but
Yeah.
as far as putting in the list, it's like, is there going to be enough decks where I need Oasis to warrant putting it in, or is there
Yeah.
not? Let me go ahead and flip a coin real fast.
Yeah. I think that's
It,
also one of the main reasons why Oasis is so frequently a two off. It's because
mm-hmm,
like I mean, you never want to see two of them in the same hand. That's one thing,
never.
right? Like that just kind
Mm-hmm,
of sucks. And you also kind of don't really want it to take up three sideboard slots unless you're like, I don't know, living in a place where there's 50% of your local meta is Kano or something. And maybe it's a little
mm-hmm.
bit better then. But
Which I
apart,
feel sorry for you if you
yeah.
do. By the way.
If that's the case, my condolences. But
Mm-hmm,
yeah, usually like in Uzuri as well, if I've played this card, it was always a two of. I don't think I've ever played a three of Oasis Respite.
mm-hmm,
Even when I was like really scared of like Kano or Azalea or the decks where it's good basically. So
mm-hmm.
okay, and then unfortunately still Remembrance, but yeah, it's gonna leave
Yeah.
eventually.
There there are a couple interesting things about this list that
Mm-hmm.
looking back in retrospect is not in the list and 100% should be.
Yeah.
I'm specifically talking about two cards here.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is substantially less impactful in that I think we should have been on Codex of Bloodrot.
Okay.
Um, Recently, I've become a lot more of a fan of Codex of Bloodrot, and
Mm-hmm.
we'll talk about it a little bit more once it shows up. And
Yep.
I think I started running that in heavy,
Mm-hmm.
maybe, but we'll talk about that one a little bit more later. It should have been in as early as Outsiders,
Mm-hmm.
but the other one is actually really interesting. And we'll probably get a little bit more into it later, but I think this list should have been running looking for scrap
Okay.
because that is a really good extender available to the
Mm-hmm.
assassin class. Um, but you'll notice looking at this list that there's no way to turn on looking for scrap.
Yeah.
So why would you be running it? And the answer is I think we should have also been running ways to turn it on.
Okay.
Instead of the blue annihilate the arms, blue plunder the poor,
Mm-hmm.
sack the shifty, unmovable rob the rich. They
Just run
should have
like
been blue
Infect,
stealth cards.
Wither, or something like that. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yep.
they should have been blue stealth cards to be able to turn on looking for
Mm-hmm.
scrap because that card is just so good. And
Mm-hmm.
the difference between a plunder the poor and a infect is just not super high. Like
Yeah.
it's not a very large difference. They're blue cards that you don't want to be attacking with
Mm-hmm.
anyways, and you kind of just have to attack with them in the late game when you need to. But
Yeah.
by the time you're presenting a plunder the poor at the end of the game, it's like the banish doesn't really matter. So you might as well be running the stealth cards that
Yeah.
can turn on looking for scrap because that is just such a powerful extender.
Makes
Even
sense. Yeah.
if looking for scrap is just a sideboard card against
Mm-hmm.
things like Dromai, it's still such a powerful extender that we should have been doing that. We should have been on stealth cards, but no one wanted to because stealth cards they did not have any ability in Arachne
Yeah. Yeah.
Huntsman. They did in like solitary confinement and Azuri because well that was the idea of the stealth cards.
Yeah.
The hero cards gave the stealth cards effects,
Yeah.
and so for that reason, every single Arachne player back then was super against stealth cards.
Yeah.
We didn't run any of them, and we should have been more open-minded to running those stealth cards instead of just writing them off
Right.
because there were some really powerful things we could do with them in conjunction with looking for scrap.
I mean, to be fair, even in Uzuri in the beginning, people didn't really run blue stealth cards, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the early Uzuri lists were mostly as soon as they started getting a little more focused, they were mostly like redline decks, right? The kind of deck that was pioneered by Ban Dodd and Sam Dando, essentially, right? Where you try to run as little blues as you could physically get away with, to enable Ravenous Rabble, actually. So like a similar idea in deck building, but you just went like, I don't want to pitch ever, and I'm just going to run redline because I can cheat pitch through using Uzuri's hero ability, right? And I think it took like Sebastian Kleiner to get second place at the calling in, I think it was either Amsterdam or Utrecht. I don't remember exactly. And he was kind of like the first person to actually run blue stealth cards and to really run looking for a scrap and to show people why that was a good idea, because he was like kind of going the reverse way, where he was like, right, if I'm attacking with a stealth card and I put it on the bottom, it doesn't matter if it's a red or a blue. I can, like, they work the same way. Blue isolate and red isolate are functionally identical outside of like niche scenarios where you do like nimblism into red isolate into like razor's edge or something, where you do, which we refer to as like a DIY macho grande, basically, during the like redline Uzuri days. Outside of those pretty niche interactions, it doesn't matter if you run blue or red stealth cards. And the blues are more flexible because you can pitch them to daggers, you can pitch them to CNC, right? So you have like more flexibility, because you can also pitch those cards. And then they also enable playing looking for a scrap, which is like a fantastic extender and just generally way more reliable than Ravenous Rabble ever was. Because like, even if you're on 5 blues in your list, Ravenous Rabble still flips the blues occasionally. It happens, and it always sucks when it does. You always hate that you put it in your deck when that happens. So, but yeah, so I think Arakni players weren't like unique in not recognizing the value of blue stealth attacks initially. So.
Yeah, it did take us a very long time to get there. We'll see them pop up, but I think we should have been doing it as early as Outsiders.
Yeah.
It's not going to show up for a very long time, though.
I think it took until like part the Mistveil for that to really become popular, because we had actually good blue stealth cards in part the Mistveil.
Yeah, we'll get to that later on when we hit part the Mistveil, but that was kind of basically LSS just being like, hey guys, you are able to run these cards.
Yeah.
Here's the reason why you're running these cards, and they just threw it into our face, and we're like, okay, fine, we'll listen.
Then
you
figured out, hey, hang on, now that we run these, we can also do other stuff with them that we would have been able to do for like a year now, but we just kind of didn't. Yeah. Again,
yeah,
makes sense,
we definitely should have been doing it for the whole year, but
right.
We got there in the end. We got there.
Okay, so this takes care of like the Outsiders meta. And now let's go into Dusk Till Dawn, which I think changes very little.
Yeah, there are exactly 2 changes.
Yeah. So one change is we have Warmonger's Diplomacy in here, which is like, yeah, it's a good card. It's unfortunately a very expensive card. It's not very... It's not like Assassin is not the best class to utilize this card. Like, I was very against running Warmongers in Uzuri for the longest time, simply because it's so hard to get like Go Again, and then you need to be able to have Go Again to really end your chain on like a Warmongers, or alternatively your entire turn is just block 9 Warmongers, or like block 6 Warmongers Arsenal a card, something like this. And that's just kind of like often not a very good way of using your turn, specifically in Uzuri. And I guess in Arakni, it's kind of like, it hurts a little bit less maybe, because you're playing very defensive anyways, and then just going, okay, block with my whole hand, play Warmongers, pass the turn is like fine. You're just fine doing that. It doesn't hurt you as much. So maybe that's why it was accepted by Arakni earlier than it was by Uzuri, I guess.
Yeah, but we were still only on 1, because the matchups that Warmongers was good into were matchups that we were already good into.
Okay.
So we didn't really need to commit too much to those matchups. It was just kind of like, okay, yeah, sure, we'll run one of them as a button to make those matchups easier.
Okay.
I know a couple people were on 3, a couple people were on 2. I was always just on 1.
Right.
Because, it wasn't as necessary back then.
Makes sense,
The other change in Dusk Till Dawn is, you may have noticed that Sack the Shifties turn into Slay the Scholars.
Yeah.
This was the time when I actually put together that data set, and
Yep.
the very long debate over sack the shifties versus slay the scholars was swiftly ended with very
Hard
very visible math,
yeah,
very hard
hard
data.
data.
Uh-huh. And everyone was just like, oh, okay, guess we're running Slay now. And then we all ran Slay.
Fair, fair.
Just an immediate, like, oh, okay, yeah, that
Yep.
makes sense. We'll put Slay in our decks.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I get
Mhm.
that. Okay, so that takes care of Dusk Till Dawn. Not a lot to say. There's not too many changes in here. And then we move over to Bright Lights. And Bright Lights had one very notable card, and then another card that was less notable. And I think we won't see that again after this. The one card that was kind of notable was Already Dead, which I'm kind of partial to because that was my spoiler card actually back then. So far, still the only spoiler I've ever gotten. So if anyone from LSS is watching this, I would love to have another one. Basically, I think still my favorite memory of the game is like getting this spoiler card and then getting to tease every Arachne player on the planet, like all three of them, by you know slowly showing them tiny tidbits of what this card was able to do. And then the excitement when it was like fully revealed and people were actually looking at it and figuring out some of the interactions you can do with this card. Like I still remember when we first figured out that, hang on, I don't have to banish a card on this chain link, it can be on any chain link in the combat chain. So if they ever block with equipment, I can just take that away from them. And that was just like an interaction that's really fun. It doesn't pop up a whole lot. Like usually this card is just, it's a big bonk. It has a very good stat line, and that's kind of the main reason why you play it. But occasionally you have these interactions where you can banish something from a previous chain link, and it's just really interesting. So
Yeah,
I'm a huge fan. I love this card, but I'm slightly biased. So
yeah, as we mentioned earlier, that all you got is really good against Assassin, and Already Dead is a way to turn that off. That is one of my favorite uses of Already Dead, is just to say, oh, you stopped my dagger with a card that will actually just draw you a card later. What if I said that you don't get to draw that card anymore?
Yeah,
how would that make you feel? So Already Dead, that's one of the primary use cases of the card. But you said it's one of your favorite cards, and unfortunately, it's very low on my list of enjoyable cards. It's the memories around Already Dead is great. I really loved when you were coming into the chat and just teasing us there. That was one of the first times that we actually interacted.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we interacted very much at all because you were mostly in Azuri and I was mostly
yeah. Like I wasn't really big on Arachne because I never really, outside of dabbling with them at like armory level stuff, I never played Arachne, so there was just not a lot of reason for me to hang out in that chat.
Yeah, but even so, though, we started talking at that point, and now you're one of the people that I like talking to about Assassin all the time, just bouncing some ideas off of. So very good thing that you started teasing us in the Arachne chat. Definitely a very good memory there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, though, Already Dead is not a great card. Already Dead is actually one of the best cards in the list for a reason that makes me very upset about it. It is functionally a 2-for-6 that says the word contract and on hit banish the top card of the game. The contract condition doesn't matter because the amount of times you're going to hit a non-action card is pitiful to none. It's one of the lowest hitting contracts in the entire game. It's only beat out by Nyx the Nimble, which is just reaction cards. This one at least can hit block cards in instance. But it wasn't like, it's not going to hit very often. And then the interaction where it's banishing the top card and a defending card, it can sometimes do that all you got. It can sometimes hit a blocking equipment. It's such a niche interaction, though. It's not going to happen very often.
It doesn't happen
the big thing about this card is that it costs 2 and attacks for 6. And that is one of the most premium stat lines that we can have in the deck. It's just a really good 2-for-6. I wish that we had any other 2-for-6 contract, because I would probably run it instead of Already Dead, even if it didn't have a disruptive element attached. If it had a better contract condition, the auxiliary silver is probably more important than the occasional defending card. So I definitely wish that we had a better 2-for-6, but just the fact that it is a 2 for 6 makes it an auto include in the list. It's just really good at the stat line it is. It just doesn't warrant the price point of like $30.
No, it does not. Like, that is definitely the case, but I think that is less Already Dead's fault and more the fault of the rest of Bright Lights just not being very good cards, and therefore the value in the set has to go somewhere. So it's going to this card, which is kind of like, it's not even an assassin staple. Like, it's run in Arakni and sometimes in Uzuri, and like very, very rarely in new. I think I've seen like one or two new lists that run this, usually because it just has a good stat line, and then sometimes you get to snipe equipment with it, and it's an assassin attack, so it takes all of the reactions in the deck. That's relevant. But yeah, it's I wouldn't call it an assassin staple even. Like, it's definitely not in every assassin deck, so
yeah,
it does not warrant the price point. I completely agree with you on that.
Yeah, which is honestly, if it was a $2 card, I'd be much more a fan of Already Dead. It might be one of my favorite cards in the deck. But because of the amount of times that a new player will pop into the discussion and they'll be asking,
I need this?
Hey, what's the buying order? Do I need to get this? Why is it in everyone's deck? I just have to tell them, hey, look, this card, if you have it, you need to run it in your deck. It is one of the strongest cards that we can run. If you don't have it, though, it is not worth picking up until you are literally at the very last purchase.
Don't
you
prioritize
your
it, basically.
You want to pick up your Command and Conquers, your Eradicates, even though that's like a cheaper one.
Yeah.
This is the last card you need to be buying because it is so expensive for only a marginal increase in value.
Yeah, you don't want to spend $100 on Already Dead when you could spend $100 on like a Tunic or 2 Command and Conquers, basically, if you can get them for that price point. But somewhere in that vicinity, makes sense.
Exactly.
So it's kind of it's a little unfortunate because but it is what it is. Like, not much we can do. And
it's still a good card.
It's a good card. It's one of those cards where I don't really think we'll see a reprint of this anytime soon. I'm still hoping that they're gonna reprint Command and Conquer in the near future, and maybe also Codex of Frailty, because that card is like ridiculously expensive. But I think Already Dead is just kind of low on their priority list to reprint. It is what it is. And then we have in the sideboard Shriek Razors here, which was the other card from Bright Lights that was a playable assassin card, a legendary at that. But I think out of all of the buyback equipment pieces, this is easily the worst one. Yeah, like even worse than Redback Shroud.
Such a bad card.
Yeah.
Because when you look at this condition, not only does it cost 2 resources, but your opponent has to defend with a card for it to work, and that defending card has to be an attack action card.
And it has to defend an assassin attack. Like, there's just so many conditions on it.
It's too many conditions. And it's the reason it's in this deck is more of a response to a trend in the meta, where the main reason that we were running Flick Knives was for Nerve Scalpel, right? For that interaction. And maybe it should have been just for the your opponent starts at 2 less life. But even at this point in time, the main reason that I was running Flick Knives was Nerve Scalpel. But starting in Bright Lights, we'll actually see more decks running less defense reactions. Nerve Scalpel becomes worse and worse over time. And so the Shriek Razors is there to kind of follow that trend by, if we aren't running Flick Knives, if we're not running into those defense reactions, maybe having the utility of the Shriek Razors is better. It's not too much better, but into certain matchups, it might be a little bit better. So a lot of us were experimenting with Shriek Razors into some matchups and Flick Knives into the other, which is why it exists there. It probably shouldn't have been there. I probably should have just used the Shriek Razors for a different, maybe like an additional Oasis or an additional Down and Dirty, or just anything else. It probably shouldn't have been there, but it was there. And so this Shriek Razors is not good.
It's unfortunately not. It's a cool card. Really cool artwork, and like in theory it's an interesting effect, but it just has like too many conditions attached to it, basically. That's the main reason, right? If it cost 1 to break it, I could maybe see it, right? Because you could go like, okay, I can play like a surgical extraction, and then if they kind of block that with like a piece of equipment and an attack and it's a clean block, maybe I can get over it, something like that. But it's like, it's too conditional and too expensive for what it does, which is ultimately like a really bad shred. it's like a
Hmm.
it's like a terrible shred on an equipment piece that costs 2. It's just, yeah, not very good card. All right.
Yeah.
So let's.
Notably, though, the bright lights is where I did where I have probably my best result on this hero.
Mm-hmm,
I went to a calling down in actually where I live here in Dallas,
mm-hmm.
and I
Dallas
managed to
Fort
have a
Worth, yeah.
yep. I had a positive win rate at 4-3, which
All right.
um, I wish it was better. Unfortunately, I ran into 2 Dromize during that, so
Ah, yeah.
you
It's
win
like
some, you lose some.
it's
But
gem, unfortunately, yeah.
mhm, mhm. But when I'm going to the same event as one of the other really good Arachne players, Wookie,
Mm-hmm.
and we both walked away from that event with 4-3, it was like, yeah, okay,
Yep.
I think I'm pretty good at doing
I
this.
think you don't have to feel bad about that. Yeah. I think
Exactly,
that's pretty
exactly.
solid. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm very proud of this list,
Yeah.
personally.
It's
This one.
good stuff, I think. All right. Let's
Yeah.
move over to heavy hitters, and we're moving
Hmm.
towards like the kind of the ending. So there was a couple of changes in heavy hitters, a couple of cards that Assassin got. Um,
Hmm.
and I think also sort of like a little bit of a shift in how you approach the deck,
Hmm.
maybe forced by those cards in a way. So let's talk about
Yeah.
the big one first, which was Arachne finally got a spec that actually deserves the name. Coercive
Yeah.
Tendency. So you now have a spec that doesn't actively make your deck worse by putting it in.
I love Coercive Tendencies. It's
Mm-hmm.
such a fun card. The effect is also just really flavorful. Like,
Yep.
look at the top 3 cards, banish one of them. You just get to snipe something on the top of the deck.
Yep.
The second effect, giving go again to your combat chain, is yeah, that's cool, but it's a super flavorful. Just look at the top 3 and banish one
Mm-hmm.
of them. The go again part though is actually it did something really weird to a lot of players,
Mm-hmm.
myself included. I fell into this trap. Go again made us play more aggressive because of
Yep.
coercive tendencies. And if you remember back at the beginning when we were talking about various play styles of
Mm-hmm.
Arachne, that's not good. Playing super aggressively is not a good way to play Arachne. And
Yep.
you'll notice in this list, my blue count is at 14. I'm running
Yep.
a ton of contracts. I'm
Yep.
way more than any other version of the list. It's just I approach this a lot more aggressively than I should have. This
Yep.
is very much a black sheep of my lists. And it is probably the list I am least proud of
Yep.
because of that. Because I fell into that trap with coercive tendencies and used go again to just create some really large
Yep.
combat chains. The way that coercive tendencies should be played, and is now how I play coercive tendencies, is just to follow up with a 0 cost.
Yeah.
Follow up with one single attack, and even then, you don't even have to.
Yeah.
Sometimes just the banish is good enough, but
Mm-hmm.
following up with like a plunder the poor, I'll leave no witnesses. The best case scenario, following up with a codex of frailty.
Yep.
That's what you're using coercive tendencies for. Any attempt at 3 chain link steep is just you're going too far. You're going in the wrong
Mm-hmm.
direction. It's not the point of the card.
Yep.
But it definitely you'll see it in how this list is set up. It pushed me in that direction, which was not very good. And this was I did not enjoy playing this list. This is the first Arachne list that I played that I was just like, I don't know if this is what I want to be doing with my game plan. In fact, around this time, there was a battle hardened down here that I went to and I got 1 win at,
Mm-hmm.
because it was even more aggressive than what it was here. And that almost turned me off from the hero I almost had to take a break from that.
Right.
And we'll see as we get into various versions of the deck going later that I moved completely away from this.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a great list. It was definitely matching the ideas of coercive tendencies in a way that it shouldn't have.
I think,
But
I think a lot of people went into that direction when the card was initially
yes,
released. They just saw like, oh, it
100%.
gives go again to my entire turn, so I can
Mm-hmm.
stack together like 3 or 4 contracts and just make like a whole ton of silver, and then maybe I can use that in some way to win games. And I mean, I think that probably happens sometimes. But again, I think the main issue with this was like you have 3 coercive tendencies in your deck, and you need a very specific hand to be able to actually convert them that way. So we're once again in Magical Christmas Land scenario where very specific hands have to line up in a very specific way to really make the most out of them. And that's just not something that's going to happen in most games. Like, this is not a combo deck, right? This is not like a Dash IO deck where you can just kind of like, all right, I'm going to play a turn where I play out basically my entire deck and I just draw like 20 cards or something and play a bunch of system resets. We've all seen that on camera. Some decks can do that. Arakni is definitely not one of them, even with coercive tendencies.
Yeah, no, Arakni is not a combo deck, and it was treated like a combo deck here.
Yeah.
And that was not a good move. But I did
kind of
learn a couple of good things when doing that, though. Codex of Bloodrot shows up for the first time in this list, and that is a card that I am now a huge fan of. I will never leave Codex of Bloodrot at home. I'm always going to put 2 copies of that in any assassin list going forward. It's just, that is one of my favorite assassin cards right there. Just it pseudo intimidates the opponent's hand by putting a card in the arsenal. It allows you to use a death touch without having to block with it. But the more important thing is that it's free. You create a ponder at the end to draw a card and put an arsenal. So it doesn't cost a card on your turn. And it's just 2 free damage. Just 2 free damage, which the biggest thing that Arakni has been struggling with over the course of the entire history of this deck is being aggressive and being able to get them into a tempo lock situation. Codex of Bloodrot, those 2 cards represent 4 damage, which makes it a lot easier to get them into a tempo lock situation. And it doesn't even cost a card. It just, you create that ponder, so it doesn't, you net a card out of this, you net nothing. It just, you play it, create the ponder, and now your opponent has 4 less life in the game, and that makes tempo locking substantially easier.
It also sometimes lines up with your arsenal disruption in a way where the opponent is punished for not arsenaling a card, which is something they often do. Like a lot of aggro decks specifically, they will just respond to you running Leave No Witnesses and Command and Conquer by never arsenaling. Or they run like Crown of Providence, and then as soon as that is gone, they just never arsenal another card for the entire game. I've definitely had that happen. Specifically with like aggro decks like Fi, Katsu, Dash IO has done that sometimes against me. And they just go like, okay, your CNC just turns into a vanilla 6. Your Leave No Witnesses just turns into, banish the top card of my deck, I don't care. And then Codex of Bloodrot really punishes that, because now they have to arsenal a card, and now your arsenal disruption is actually relevant again. So it's a very, very neat way of utilizing this. And I love the card personally. I ran it in Uzuri for a very long time. Haven't run it in New currently because it's just really hard to find the slots for it when you have better things to do. New just has a really pushed card pool. Let's be realistic about it. So it's hard to find hard to find space for something like Codex of Bloodrot, which is a good card, but it's 2 damage at the end of the day, you know? That's kind of like the main problem with it, is like you sometimes just have better things to do with your cards than this.
Yeah, which in the other heroes, I can definitely see why you might want to just do better things with your card. In Arakni, the ability to put them at 4 less life to get close to that tempo lock is just,
I think really in Arakni, it's probably one of the best extenders you have access to.
100%.
Yep.
100%.
And I would even say for Uzuri, that's still the case. For New, it kind of falls off a little bit. But I've seen lists that still run it because it's a good card. Like getting damage
I ran it in New.
Like getting damage for effectively free is just pretty nice.
Yeah, it's also really good into Enigma.
That's true. Yep.
Really good into Enigma.
That is true. Yes. Prism too. Actually.
Yeah.
It's one of the very few.
It is good into Prism.
It's one of the very few cards that can play around Arclight Sentinel to an extent, at least. So,
yeah, I actually there's no prisms in my locals,
right?
So I've never. I think
I've
played like once into Prism, so that it's not something that I usually think about there. Right. But you're right; it would be really good into Prism.
Yeah, it is. It is. I can confirm that. Like I have a Prism in my locals that is quite good on the deck, so I have a lot of experience into Prism. I hate playing against Prism, but I've had a lot of time to figure out what cards work and what cards don't work against Prism, and Codex of Bloodrot is definitely pretty high on that list.
Yeah, you'll notice with my lists, especially after Dromai hit Living Legend, I stopped running poppers
Makes sense, yeah.
because there's no prisms in my local, so I
Yeah.
don't have to worry about them.
Okay, that's fair.
So
That's
I'm
fair.
just not running very many
Yep.
poppers anymore. Um,
That's legitimate, yeah.
yeah,
Lucky
the
you.
other card that you see popping up in here though that I learned even in spite of a bad deck that I didn't enjoy, but I've
Hmm.
learned to use now is that Infect sitting right there. This is
Yeah,
the first stealth card that shows up in these
that's
lists.
true
Um,
actually, yeah.
yeah, Infect is on the surface. It's just 0 for 1 on hit Blood Rot.
Yep.
Same thing as the Codex of Blood Rot. That's a 3 damage blue.
Yep.
That's just a regicide without the
Yeah,
downside.
it's just side with no downside. Fantastic
um,
card.
yeah, Infect is probably one of the strongest blues that Assassin has access to, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
it's probably
It's
true.
just
Like,
if you get not if you're playing for like first cycle.
hmm,
If you're planning to win that quickly, Infect is not good. Infect's power comes online in the like second, third
yeah,
cycle,
yeah,
where okay, yeah, this is presenting 3 damage. You're at 5.
yeah,
Do you want to take that 3 damage? It is just such an impactful card. It might only be coming in for 1, but the
yeah.
the threat that it represents is really,
It
really
is
good.
definitely it's a thing, yeah.
And
All right.
it starts to change a shift in my mindset as
Hmm.
well with stealth cards. This is where I started to recognize that maybe it's okay to run stealth
Yeah.
cards. And then we'll see in the next set, it's like, oh man,
Stealth
we're running the
cards,
stealth
they're
cards.
actually
Yeah.
good, yeah.
hmm
Okay, yeah, interesting. And one other change that has crept in here is Concealed Blade. I would assume this has something to do with the fact that you're also running 4 daggers now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Specifically Graven Call, which is the other card that Assassin got from heavy hitters.
hmm
Let's talk about Graven Call for a second, because I think this card was like initially somewhat underappreciated. Like, I mean,
Oh, yeah.
very initially, people were extremely hyped about it because we thought we could stack the +1 counters.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then,
When Josh came in, like
yeah,
day
and told
one of
us, nope.
reveal and ruined that for us, we were like,
Yeah.
oh, man.
The thing is, like, under the current rule set, when the card was released, that would have actually been possible, and they
hmm
actually changed the rules, or specifically made like a rule exception for Graven Call, to make it
Yes.
not work, which I think is fair because that would have been ridiculous. Let's be honest. But
Yeah. So
um,
for those at home wondering what we're talking about right here,
mhm,
under the rules when Graven Call was revealed, not released because they changed them by the time release happened,
yeah,
it was possible to, let's say you had 6 silver out and you had no weapons out. You
yeah,
could activate Graven Call from your graveyard. That trigger goes on, and then you activate it another 2 times with all 6 of your silver. The
yeah,
Graven Call it gets equipped with a +1 counter. The graveyard activation, it says you can only activate it while it's in the graveyard, but now that it's moved, well, you've already activated those 3 times, so you
yep,
don't have to worry about that. Those 3 triggers still exist. You equip it with a +1 counter, gets the counter. You then have a second empty equipment slot, which was necessary because if that equipment slot was, or if the weapon slot was filled, you couldn't actually equip it.
yep,
So you wouldn't be able to do that. But if that was empty, you could then equip it into the other slot with another +1 counter, and
yep.
then do it again, and now you have 3 +1 counters on it. The rules were changed on release to make it so that that couldn't happen, and every assassin player was sad for it. We lost our 10 damage dagger, and it
Yep.
was probably a good thing because
Yeah,
that would
I
have
think
been
so.
absolutely broken.
That would, even if you just get it to like 4, coming in for 4 with go again every single turn would have been ridiculous. So
Insane.
it's still a
Um,
very good piece of equipment, though. Like, even with no shenanigans where you can stack the counters, this is
mhm.
still a pretty powerful piece of equipment.
Yeah, but you'll notice it's in the sideboard here because
Hmm.
I significantly undervalued it.
Yeah,
I was on the side of the debate that said that Graven Call was not good.
yeah,
That Graven Call was worse than even Already Dead for
yeah,
support, worse than even Shriek Racers,
hmm,
because it didn't present an on hit and it was just vanilla damage, and
yeah,
that's not great.
hmm,
And so it was in the sideboard. I wasn't even running it at first. I managed to be convinced by I think it came from a discussion with Archon where I
yeah. He was a
managed to be
big
convinced to
early
put it
fan of
in.
the card. Yeah,
Yeah, he was a very big fan of the card, but I put it in the list. But I was very hesitant to be like relying on it.
hmm,
Hence, it's in the sideboard and Concealed Blade. I would never put it in the main board. I would always throw a dagger and then Concealed
yeah,
Blade it
yeah.
in.
That's how I used
Be,
it too in Azuri. I think the
mhm.
only matchups that where I started with Graven Call were like the Guardians, like Bravo specifically. where I recognize that, okay, I need to start with Graven Call because this is my win condition, basically. I need to have access to that 2 damage every turn to be able to fatigue them. So my main focus was just, all right, get 2 silver ASAP and then get Graven Call active. But for every other matchup, I just had it in the sideboard. I did the exact same thing that you did. I maybe flicked like a Nerf Scalpel earlier in the game, and then I was able to run Conceal Blade and re-equip the Graven Call and maybe do some things with that. But that was never super consistent.
Yeah, Graven Call is... I was initially very hesitant about the card, but I've since completely changed my mind.
Yep.
Graven Call is the strongest dagger that we are running.
Right.
And when we get into the part of the Mistveil deck, I will talk a little bit more about the strength of Graven Call, because then it's going to show up in the main board.
Yep.
But around this time, it was in the sideboard, and it was not used to the effectiveness that it should have been. And so it was kind of just sitting there. In retrospect, I should have probably listened to Archon a lot earlier and actually worked with the card, because Graven Call is insane.
The man does know what he's talking about.
The man knows what he's talking about.
Good, very good deck builder. So yeah,
very, very good. But no, in this version of the deck, it was just sitting there because I was very hesitant on it and wasn't really actually using it to the full effect. But that'll change later, and when we get to that, I'll talk a little more about that, because we're going to talk. We're gonna go over those equipment all again in part of the Mistveil, how they've changed once we get there. So
their utilization has changed mostly. All right. And then we also have Scale Peeler, just because you want to be consistently re-equipping daggers with Conceal Blade. I would assume also because this is heavy hitters, so Kasai.
More important part was heavy hitters.
You kind of needed Scale Peeler to be able to keep up with Dynamo decks. So you just kind of had to run it. And Balance of Justice.
If you aren't running Scale Peeler, you lose into Dynamo. If you are running Scale Peeler, you
probably still lose into Dynamo, but you have a better chance at winning.
So we're probably going to have to run Scale Peeler again going into the next set, because Dynamo's coming back.
Pretty sure,
in this meta specifically, we had to be running Scale Peeler.
Would not surprise me, And then we have Balance of Justice, which I think is just, a lot of cards in heavy hitters meta were drawing cards. A lot of decks were drawing cards, so Balance is just, it's a good card. I don't think you have to talk a lot about this. It's just a solid card. And then
basically just a 5-block equipment,
some of the more questionable sideboard choices here, like Razor Reflex, are explained by what you were trying to do with this deck. So that kind of checks out. And what kind of like what confuses me a little bit is you were trying to play very aggressive, but you upped the remembrance count. That was just kind of like a little bit surprising to me.
Yeah, it was. I upped the remembrance count because it meant that I had 6 more copies of Enlightened Strike.
Right. Okay.
Not a good idea.
Okay.
Not a good idea.
Okay.
But before we get to the part of the Mistveil, actually, this deck, as I've talked about already, I didn't like it. And because I didn't like it, when part of the Mistveil came out, I actually shelved Arakni for a month or two, and didn't look at Arakni. I didn't look at them at all. And so when New came out, I started playing a lot of New, and I played New in a very similar way to older versions of Arakni. But because it was a new card pool, because it was a new hero, I was starting from the ground up. I did not use my Arakni decks as inspiration for New, or as like a template for New. I more just was like, all right, let's take the ideas of these contract cards and put them into New. And I built what I would like to consider a very good fatigue New list. I didn't last very long on the list, for obvious reasons. That's why we're talking right now. But I didn't last very long on the list, and so it definitely could have been better than where I ended on the hero. But I completely changed my focus. I got off of Arakni, and then when we get into the part Mistveil version of the Arakni deck, when I got back to Arakni, instead of using any of the previous lists before this, any of heavy hitters, any of bright lights, anything before that, I actually used the New list as my template for the new Arakni list. So it might look similar on a card-to-card basis somewhat when we get there, but it's completely different from even the baseline ground up being built type of idea.
Let's just move over there and see what exact changes you've actually made. So I think like
look at those changes.
I think that the biggest like most superficial, like if we're just looking at this, like the top part here, it doesn't look too different. Like Graven Call's in the main board now. You've talked about that a little bit. We can touch on that later again. Then obviously there's just a Nick here, and that's kind of already a little bit of a spoiler. And then we move into the blue slots, and then suddenly it's all stealth cards down here. I think that's kind of like the big change is basically, hey, there's now actually good blue stealth cards that we can play in the form of like Prognosis and Bonds of Agony. And then we have Just a Nick, which like further pushes those cards. So maybe let's try to build our blue base around that.
Yeah. So the blue base was just like, what if we ran the stealth cards anyways?
Yeah.
Just a Nick was LSS pushing it into our face to say, hey guys, you are allowed to play stealth cards in Arakni. I know they don't have a hero ability that cares about stealth cards.
Yeah.
Look at this card though. It's a 0 for +5. Just like +5 to an attack with 1 or less, and then on hit banish. That's just a really good reaction.
That's
and
everything Arakni wants to do, basically. Yeah.
Exactly. So I put a bunch of these stealth cards in the blue base. Infect, a holdover from the. I always run blue Infect now, just based on the strength that I've seen in it. It's a 0 for 3, and then when you have Just a Nick, now it's a 0 for 8. 2 card 8 right there on a blue is just that's some pretty good numbers right there. So I really like Infect in the list, and then you've got Desires of Flesh and Art of Desire, which are basically just pseudo contracts. But instead of trading silver, they gain you life. And then Persuasive Prognosis, one of the best disruptive stealth cards, because you can. It's basically just copies 4, 5, and 6 of Surgical Extraction in the late game. And that's the primary use case of it, is being copies 4, 5, and 6 of Surgical Extraction. And then you've got Bonds of Agony, which that is a card that completely changed how the deck was even being played in the equipment slot. So I've been mentioning how the equipment completely changed the utility of it from Dynasty to where we are today. And that's all due to Bonds of Agony. From Black Tech Whisperers and Mask of Perdition, because I no longer care about the effects of those two equipment. They functionally exist as +1 reaction, which is insane. Because if you play out a Bonds of Agony with a Just a Nick in your hand, and you still have Mask of Perdition and Black Tech Whisperers up, that is a 2-card 9 on hit, banish an insane amount of cards. And that is incredibly powerful. I am setting that up. I'm okay putting a Bonds of Agony and leaving it in my arsenal for 4 turns. I'm okay doing that with a Just a Nick. Even if it turns off Codex of Frailty and Codex of Bloodrot, I don't care. I'm going to set up Bonds of Agony next to a Just a Nick with Mask of Perdition and Black Tech Whispers. And I'm going to do a 2-card 9 that will eat parts of your hand and parts of your deck. It is insane. The first Just a Nick is always going to be played on a Bonds of Agony. Every single time, because that is just so good.
It's probably the most powerful target you have for it. Like we were talking the other day about like how I kind of like Prognosis a little bit better, actually, in terms of like overall heavy lifting that it does for the deck. And I think that's partially because of because I value the life total that you get from Prognosis, specifically if you pair it with Just a Nick, a little bit more than I value the deck damage that Bonds of Agony does, right? Because like, and I think that's mostly because we approach the game from like 2 different sides, right? Like I play Assassin, but I don't play a Fatigue Assassin. Like even when I play New or Usuri, I play Aggressive Assassin, right? So my goal is for the most part to win the game first cycle. Like I will play Fatigue if the game lines up that way, and that sometimes happens, specifically against like aggro decks. Sometimes your best plan of winning is just to be defensive and just fatigue them, and I will happily play that strategy if it lines up. But I don't play specifically for that play style. That's just something that sometimes happens, right? Whereas you as an Arakni player, even if you're playing other assassins like New, you're inherently playing towards a fatigue game state. That's like your main thing that's ingrained into your like play style, right? So you always play for second cycle, you always play for the late game, and you say, I care more about taking 2 cards out of your deck with Bonds of Agony than I care about immediately disrupting and immediately gaining some extra life from Prognosis. And I think that's like one of the key differences. And I've noticed that a lot in like these conversations that we've had, that we just have these like 2 radically different approaches to the game, and they massively influence how we evaluate certain cards. And it's super interesting because I love these discussions where you just talk to somebody that plays the same class, maybe even the same hero, but they just have a different approach to how they play that hero, and that results in completely different evaluation of cards like Bonds of Agony or like Persuasive Prognosis. That's really cool to see that.
Yeah, I mean, when you put Bonds of Agony in with Adjust the Nick, it's similar to Eradicate, except unlike Eradicate, if I present a Bonds of Agony, my opponent might throw 9 in front of it, and I can just say, okay, cool, I'm going to save that Just the Nick for the next Bonds of Agony. Whereas Eradicate, it's like, okay, well, there goes what I was trying to do there. And also, Bonds of Agony is coming in for 9 compared to Eradicate's like 4 or 6, depending on what reactions you can put in it. And the difference in that damage amount is insane, because the Bonds of Agony going for 9 means that you get to get closer to a Tempo Lock, which allows you to do a lot of these other really powerful things. It's the same reason as why Codex of Bloodrot is so good. It's as if they gave us Eradicate but made it better, and they did. And I was saying earlier that Eradicate was the best card in our deck in Dynasty. Just the Nick plus Bonds of Agony is just a really powerful thing to eat cards from deck. I don't even care about the hand disruption to some degree. Like, it's good, but it hits 3 cards in the deck. Just the Nick banishes the top card, and the Bonds of Agony banishes 2 more cards. It's just really good.
Like, that's actually, and then because you use Mask of Perdition, you turn it on, you banish an additional card on top of that. So basically, this play is like a 2-card play that gets rid of 5 cards from your opponent's deck. That's kind of insane if you think about it.
Yeah, it's just such a good fatigue attempt there. And then the second Bonds of Agony, you're probably not going to be able to do it very often. You do have Course of Tendencies that you can play on Bonds of Agony, which is a really interesting and unique play line that you can do there. Bonds of Agony, Course of Tendency. It allows you to get a second Bonds of Agony turn, but honestly, the first Bonds of Agony was good enough. I'll use the next 2 Just the Nicks for Persuasive Prognoses, for Infects, for Desires of Flesh or Art of Desire Mind.
You have a lot of that's kind of like why you have all of these blue stealths, right? Like, you have more targets for Just the Nick. And that's kind of like been the deck building approach is a little bit similar for new decks that have been also like, usually most new decks hover in this like 12 to 15 blue stealth cards range. I think nobody goes below 12, but people play like 15. Sometimes I've seen 18. Personally, I think 18 is too many, but that's like, that's a personal preference thing. I think 15 is like the sweet spot. That's where my current list is also sitting at. But my approach with new with Just the Nick is just kind of like fire it off whenever. Whenever I draw Just the Nick, the idea is I can immediately convert that into 5 damage and an extra banish. That mostly I don't even care about the banish. It's just like extra 5 damage. Like, obviously, if it lines up with a Prognosis or Bonds, I'm super happy because those are like the best targets for it. But if it lines up with like just an Infect, I also take that. It's 8 damage. I'm fine with this, I don't try to set it up in Arsenal to really specifically wait for the Bonds of Agony. I will Arsenal a Bonds and then just kind of like sit on it for a couple of turns. But that's maybe also because new just has other ways to turn it on, because you have like the double reactions in the form of like Venomous Bite and Hiss, where it's easier to make a Bonds live even without Just the Nick. But having that 2-card Bonds line with equipment is also just powerful. Right? That's like that's the ideal use case for it. Is just have Tunic up and then have like Boots or Arms in the case of new specifically, and then Just the Nick, and just do like the 2-card Bonds play. And Arakni can do that without having to care about Tunic, basically. Like, you don't care if Tunic's up or not. The opponent cannot predict if you have the Nick based on if you have Tunic up or something, right? So it's a little more flexible in that sense. The
Yeah, I
downside
mean,
is that you can usually only do it once. That's kind of like
yeah,
the price you pay for that flexibility. Yeah.
yeah. We only get to do it once, but it
Mhm.
is really impactful when we do
Yep.
do it.
Yeah, I can
And
imagine.
also just the simple idea of sometimes I'll present the Bonds of Agony and they'll just block it out and be like, okay, I'll do the next one.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Like, I mean, if they
like,
just, because they can calculate, like, you can only get up to 9, and that's kind of like,
mhm,
that's all you can do, you know? And then if they just block 9 on it, you just go like, cool, okay, Arsenal did just a nick, wait for the next card. And then they have to do it all over again.
exactly.
It's like kind of, it's like playing around the pummel, you know?
Hmm.
It doesn't usually work because then you just have the pummel in Arsenal and you have to do the same thing next turn again and again and again. Um, Obviously,
But
sometimes if you can win the game on the spot, it's worth it to play around it. But I think what frequently happens is that people just go like, all right, Bonza Agony, yeah, no blocks because I can't play around it. You know, if I play around it
mhm,
now, I have to play around it just to nick in Arsenal when the next one comes, and it's just not great to block 9 most of the time.
exactly, exactly. It's
Yeah.
but you can also there is I've had a very good success doing this where I hold on to a card, I play Bonds of Agony. The card I'm holding on to is not just a nick.
Mm-hmm.
I'm bluffing it,
You
but
just fake it
because
out. Yeah.
yeah, but because of the setup and because they know myself as
Yeah.
a player, and what I'm trying to do with
They're
Bonds of
scared of
Agony,
it. Yeah.
they're scared of it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So it people like to say that it's impossible to bluff anything in this game. I disagree.
Nah, that's definitely
Bluffing
not true.
Bonds of Agony is really,
Like
really, really, really
specifically
good.
as assassin, I think being
Mhm.
able to bluff is actually a pretty critical component of being successful with this class. It does get
Mhm.
less relevant the more you move up in terms of like opponent skill. Like I would say it's definitely harder to bluff against somebody that's like really experienced with the game and really has good meta knowledge, knows what cards you might have in your deck. It gets harder and harder to
Mhm.
do that, but it's absolutely still a critical component of playing assassin. It's like having a good poker face and knowing when you can get away with a bluff and when not. You know, that's definitely something that that you should develop as an assassin player. And assassin is definitely the class where bluffing is the most relevant in my experience. Um,
Yeah,
the other one is
100%.
warrior, obviously, because of the attack reactions. But with warrior, typically it's a lot more linear because what you're bluffing is typically just damage, right? You're just like,
Mhm.
I might have an attack reaction and that's more damage. And in the case of assassin, typically the bluffing means I have disruption and you have to play around that.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
It's definitely just I love bluffing the Bonds of Agonies with
yeah.
something that's not adjusting the hand.
It's really
It's a
fun,
great feeling.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
But what's really interesting about the Bonds of Agony though is we've already talked about it a little bit, but I just want to highlight it is that the two equipments that have been there since the beginning of the game, since the beginning of the hero, are completely changed now.
yep.
We're using them for an entirely different purpose than
Yep.
we were back in Dynasty,
Yep.
and that is just really interesting to me that the raw mechanics of the card does not change,
Yep.
but the way that we utilize them
The use
is
case. Yeah.
completely in the opposite
Mm-hmm.
direction. And that comes up again with flick knives. Is it is also completely different because there's no nerve scalpel anymore.
Yep.
This is the first list without nerve scalpel.
Yep.
It's just Graven Call. The
Yes.
reason that we run flick knives now is because you can turn on Graven Call.
Mm-hmm.
And Graven Call, we're going to talk about it now, is really good.
Mm-hmm.
If I can get the 2 silver on turn 1, which is not possible to do. I mean, it is kind of possible, but it's very unlikely.
Yeah.
But if I can get those 2 silver on turn 1, then I bring up Graven Call, and now it has +1 for the rest of the game. It's now
Yep.
2 attack. And if I'm making the game go slowly, if I'm
Yep.
trying to last 20 to 30 turns, that means that +1 damage, it is now representing 20 to 30 damage throughout
Yep.
the course of the game. Graven Call is insane.
Yep.
This card is arguably, I'm going to throw it out there. If your deck can support Graven Call, it is the strongest card in Assassin's Arsenal.
Mm-hmm.
I think this includes Codex of Frailty. I think this includes Just Nick. If you can manage to support Graven Call with the silver base, which granted is very difficult to do because not a lot of the other assassins want to be doing this,
Yeah.
but if you can, it is easily the strongest card in Assassin's Toolkit.
Yeah.
Because it's representing 20 to 30 damage in one card.
Yep.
It's insane.
Yep.
It's such a good card.
Like, not even necessarily if you can attack with it. There's also sometimes situations where you're just kind of flush with silver and you can just use Graven Call by flicking it like 3 or 4 times. And then you just go like, right, I have just reduced your starting life total to 35 or 34 just by playing this card. And
Hmm.
that already is kind of insane, you know? Like just flicking
Yeah.
Gravencall a bunch of times is like super punishing in the late game. If you're just
Yeah, I
sitting
think
on a pile of
Archon's managed to
silver,
get like 12 different flicks.
yeah. He had this like machine gun Gravencall list that what he called it, like where he just focused like really hard on generating as much silver as possible, and then just really spamming flick knives Gravencall.
Mhm.
Because one fun thing you can do with Gravencall is like you can attack with it, you can flick it, rebuy it, and attack with it again. Because the game treats this
Mhm.
as a new weapon, and it forgets about the once per turn action. Like you can attack with it several times per turn if you manage to flick it in between and then re-equip it. So you could theoretically go like attack with Gravencall, then something else, flick Gravencall, rebuy it, attack with it again, play a hurl, pay for it, flick the Gravencall, rebuy it, attack with it again. So you can do some really silly things with Gravencall. Most of the time, that's like we're in Magical Christmas Land again with
Mhm.
these kind of lines, but you can do some really interesting things with this card for sure.
Yeah, there was an event that I did that interaction for lethal once,
Mm-hmm.
where they had 2 life,
Mm-hmm.
and I had Gravencall up and 2 silver,
Yep.
and due to my resources, I just went Gravencall,
Yep.
Spider's Bite,
Yeah.
throw the Gravencall, bring
Yeah.
them down to 1.
Yeah.
They have to block all of this.
Yeah. Of course.
Attack, recur Gravencall, attack with it. They got to block that one as well, and then I come in for 4, and well, due to the breakpoint of the 4 at the end there, well,
Yep.
that's lethal.
Yep.
I have done that before. It's
Yep.
such a good feeling to be able to use that interaction for lethal. Like,
Yeah, for sure. It's a super
crazy,
interesting card.
crazy
Yeah.
call. So, and that's where flick knives has changed completely as well. Because in the past it was a button for nerve scalpel, and now I would never give up flick knives because Ravencall is just such an
Yeah.
important card,
And you needed
that's how
to
you
turn
turn on
that on.
Ravencall.
Yeah. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like, ideally, you know, you can actually combine these in a way. Like, you can use flick knives as one of the attack reactions for Bonds of Agony, so you don't have to give up
Mm-hmm.
your mask or you don't have to give up your black text for it. But I assume
Yeah.
that doesn't line up very often. It's more of like maybe you get the second Bonds of Agony very late in the game, or you've pitch stacked it with a Just a Nick, and then you use flick knives to turn it on or something like that. But I assume for the most
Mhm.
part, you're just gonna use like black text and mask to turn it on.
Yeah, it's if you have already used a mask or a black tech before
Mm-hmm.
you hit the bonds, say you do a bonds and then you mask flick knives and
Mm-hmm.
just a nick, and then you have the black tech whispers sitting around.
Yep.
Whenever you get that second bonds out, being able to get to the 3 reactions, even though you still have the black tech whispers sitting
Yeah.
up there ready to be used,
Yeah.
hitting the 3rd reaction is so difficult that
Mm-hmm.
it's not even really worth fighting over. You're really Bonds of Agony does not care about whether flick knives exist or not.
Yeah. Okay. Fair
Um,
enough.
Sometimes you can play it as a 0 for 4, use black tech mask and flick
Yep.
knives, but the times that throws up, that comes up is just so limited. It's
Yeah.
not as
I mean,
important.
I would assume like giving up effectively 3 pieces of equipment is very rarely worth it, but it's a thing you
Yeah.
can do. Like, and that's kind of
Mhm.
actually sort of unique to Arachne because Arachne is kind of the only assassin that's running like 3 attack reaction equipments. Like you have
Mhm.
sometimes you have like contract Uzuri lists that run Mask of Perdition, and I've seen Mask of Perdition actually creeping up in new lists. But those lists are typically also still running stilettos and wave, so you don't really have attack reactions that are costless, right?
Mhm.
So Arachne is kind of the only one that has like 3 0 cost attack reactions in the equipment slot into basically every matchup.
Mhm.
So that's definitely kind of interesting that you can theoretically do a 1 card bonds and still turn that on, so the opponent still has to kind of respect it a little bit. Whether
Yeah.
it's worth to cash in those 3 pieces of equipment is up for debate for sure, but it's a
Mhm.
theoretical thing that you can do, and the opponent has to think about it. So that's already kind of interesting.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's go over. Maybe we go over a little bit of. I think in the sideboard, not a whole lot has changed, except that you've gotten a whole lot of defense reactions, which I assume is like a reaction to Zen being a very dominant deck.
Yeah, I put
Mm-hmm.
those in because Zen was dominant, and
Yep.
then I never really got to use a lot of them because again,
Yeah,
Zen never
nobody
showed
played
up in
Zen.
my
Makes
locals.
sense.
I used it every once in a while, but I got punished for putting in Zen hate and then
Yeah,
not
that makes
seeing
sense.
Zen.
And
Um,
then obviously by playing 15 blue stealth cards as your blue base, you also get to play looking for a scrap, which is just, yeah, we've
mhm.
talked about it before. It's one
Such
of
a
the
good card.
best extenders that are available to, like, probably the best extender that is available to Assassin, I would say. And Assassin is kind of unique in being the only class that can really play this card. Like, I don't think it would theoretically be playable in something like Teklovasen, with some of the blue scrap cards. They would function, or you could theoretically play this in Ninja. Ninja also has a bunch of like the blue blue combo starters, like blue Hadjab, stuff like that also would count. But in Ninja, you just have better extenders. You don't need to bother with looking for a scrap. So this is really kind of like, it's an assassin card without being an assassin card, essentially. We're really the only class that regularly runs this.
It's a really, really good extender. And we talked about it back in the Outsiders list. We should have been running it a lot earlier. We were basically Justin Nick was shoved in our face and said, "You're running the blue stealths now." But then when we started running the blue stealths, I was like, maybe we should have been doing this the whole time. Look, this scrap is really good.
It is
like, that is a really good card.
Very good payoff for those, for sure. Yes.
And it's not something that you want to run into every matchup. Like, it's a 2-block. It's an extender, and sometimes you don't need to extend. But in the matchups where you need to extend, it's such a powerful tool. It's like, if you're not running it, you're throwing away free wins.
Yes, for sure.
It's such a good card.
Yeah, I agree on this. It's a really good card. Like, probably one of my favorite cards to play too. It's just super fun. All right.
Such a good card.
And then finally, we move to the last version of this, which is the Rosetta version. And Rosetta didn't give Assassin a lot of cards, and they weren't really flashy cards, but they were very good cards, in my opinion. And we're talking about the Widow set, which is like 4 pieces of equipment which act as the Assassin in-class Arcane Barrier, which we didn't have before. Like, Warrior still doesn't have this. Like, they never got in-class Arcane Barrier, and I hope they do, because they kind of need it. And what we got was Arcane Barrier that has Spell Void stapled on it as well. And this is extremely good. I would go as far as to say that these are probably the best Arcane Barrier pieces in the game.
I would agree.
It's up 100%. For debate. Like, the Arcane Barrier 2 pieces, like Skullhorn or like Dyadic Carapace, are also very good. And a lot of classes wish they had these. But I think that Arcane Barrier and Spell Void on the same card is just extremely flexible and extremely powerful. And it's easy to undervalue how much these cards actually do for the deck.
Yeah, the Widow equipment is really good. I quite enjoy these cards. I'm glad they exist. You'll notice the slots they're in are a little interesting compared to where I've been running AV in previous versions of the list. In chest, head, and legs. And the notable part is what's not there is the arms and the lantern. Is because, well, again, Flip Knives Graven Call is just really, really good. So I would never give that up, no matter what the matchup is, because that is just so important. Though when I'm running AV3, obviously I'm not running the bonds turns, because I don't have the reactions to support that. But if I'm only running AV1, I'm running the chest boost. I would rather give up Tunic over the powerful bonds turn, which is something that I wasn't expecting to say until I actually did that. And I was like, oh man, this is a good idea to not be running Tunic, because bonds is really good. It's a very good card. So it's interesting the slots that I'm running them in, but it also makes sense when you look at what the other equipment is.
I think it makes sense in the context of what your deck is trying to do. I get why you're running the chest, even though Tunic is a very good card. So that absolutely makes sense. And then for the rest of the sideboard, like, this is pretty standard stuff, except you have Poison the Well, which I guess is like a specific hate piece for a card that we've been spoilering a little bit. Like, we said we would get around to that. And that is a card that is notably also absent from this list. But if we look at that and we just go over here, the card we're talking about is obviously Count Your Blessings.
Yeah, what a horrible card. this card is easily one of the strongest cards that Arachne got in the set.
Yep.
This is a very, very good card. It's on screen right now. It's a 2-cost instant. Gain X life, where X is 3 plus the number in your graveyard. So if you're running all 9 of them, it equals 54 life.
Yep.
Which, if you're playing a fatigue deck, which Arachne is a fatigue deck, 54 life is insane.
Yeah.
It allows you to do everything that you're doing, but just better with less room for error, or with actually more room for error. You get to make mistakes because you have 94 life. And we saw that actually this morning for me, and also for you as of recording this, with Michael Hamilton and his Enigma list, I think.
No, Hamilton was on new, but he was on count your blessings. But I think
and then the finals as well. On the winner of it was the Enigma player going through. I haven't watched through it yet, but I've heard some not great things about how that card was. Have you watched through that yet?
I haven't watched the actual game, but I did watch his first top 8 round against Aurora, where Rob Catton just kind of struggled to do like anything. Like, you could skip through the video and you were like halfway through the match and the Enigma player was still sitting at like 40 life just because of Count Your Blessings. And I assume that the finals game, which I think was also against an Aurora, also went in a similar way. And there's been a lot of like debate about it online, where people are just like, all right, this is not a great experience to watch, because the Enigma player is just kind of doing nothing. They're just sitting there blocking, gaining life until the opponent finally runs out of cards, you know? And that's not, it's similar, and I think that's why we also said earlier that we would get back around to this card. It's similar in experience to what Remembrance is doing to the game, right? Remembrance in Oldhim was a very similar card, and I can guarantee if this had been around when Oldhim was legal, Oldhim would have totally played Count Your Blessings. Because like 100%. A 2-cost instant in a deck that has like resource outlets in the form of equipment is just exactly what Oldhim wants, right? He would have been all over this card. And that would have been an experience that really nobody would have enjoyed, I think. But they do similar things. Like both Remembrance and Count Your Blessings kind of artificially prolong the game in a way where the threat is now no longer your opponent's deck, but the threat is either the clock, if you're in like Swiss rounds, where like if you're unexperienced with playing these decks, it's very possible to go into a draw, right? It's very possible to go to time and not be able to finish the round in time just because the opponent has so much extra life and is so defensive. And in untimed rounds in top 8, the opponent is currently not really doing anything, but your real danger is running out of cards in your deck. Like, you have a very real chance of simply not having enough damage in your deck to kill your opponent, and then they win by default, basically.
I mean, this card existing says that Riptide doesn't get to play the game anymore.
Yeah, that's also
they just don't have the damage to get through Count Your Blessings.
Because he doesn't have a weapon. So he's naturally not great against fatigue, and with this card, it gets even worse. So I just think, like, I mean, if anybody out there is enjoying this card, I don't mean to detract from your enjoyment of this play style. If that's your thing, more power to you. But I genuinely think that this card is unhealthy for the overall game and should probably get banned, not because it's too powerful, but again, like Remembrance, because it promotes a play style that is just not enjoyable for anyone involved, essentially.
Yeah, 100%.
And that is my personal opinion, of course. Like, again, as I said, if you enjoy this type of play style, that doesn't mean I think less of you or anything. I just personally think that this is something that should not exist in the game. And yeah, that's just my opinion on it.
Yeah, but bringing it back around to Arachne, though, this is a card that should be run in the list. It is, again, with 54 life, with 54 additional life, it means that you get to make a lot more mistakes to go through with it. And so it should be run in the list, especially when you're already playing a bad hero. Having an ability to make your deck substantially better, you should take it, you should run with it. I do not do so, because I agree with you 100% on everything about this card. I don't like it. but more importantly for the list, it introduces something really interesting. This is the first card in the game that introduces a degree of macro variance, where you have to see your count your blessings to be able to get that 54 life. If you see them all too late, you lose the game. If you see them all turn 3, you win the game, right?
Makes sense.
This card introduces a level of macro variance, which, while super interesting, it is really cool that we have a degree of macro variance, is not something that I want to be doing with Arakni.
Okay.
It's not something that I find enjoyable in the deck. I want to be as consistent as possible. I'm playing, you might consider a lot of power turns that you have to high roll into, but I'm playing them in a way that I'm setting them up. Bonds of Agony, Just the Nick, I'm leaving one of those in Arsenal until I can see the other one. I'm pitch stacking my deck to turn on some high rolls into the late game using my daggers. I'm smoothing out your deck to make sure that I get there. Introducing a level of macro variance with Count Your Blessing is not something that I want to be doing. So I don't. I don't include it in the list. I just don't want to.
Makes sense.
It should be in there. It's not in there. And I stand by that decision.
No, I completely agree with everything about that. I also refuse to play this card simply because I don't want to. You know, it's like it would probably also make a new list better if you were playing for that specific playstyle. And I just don't think that's something that I want to be doing, even if it would mathematically maybe be the most efficient thing I could be doing. And I think Michael Hamilton has shown off that it is very possible to find great competitive success with a Count Your Blessings new deck, even though a lot of people were doubting that that list was viable. Like, I know we had a whole lot of like discussion about Count Your Blessings in new, and a lot of people were like dead set against it and saying, yeah, it just makes your deck worse. And I guess we have been proven that that's just not necessarily the case. Like, I mean, he didn't win Worlds, but he got to top 8, which is a huge achievement, right? So obviously Michael Hamilton is also a great player, but I think the fact that he decided to play that specific deck also shows that he thought that deck was a very viable option, and the fact that he made top 8 with it kind of, you know, proved him right. So definitely a strong card. I do hope it ends up getting banned, and I have a little bit of hope that the fact that the winning list of Worlds was in fact a Count Your Blessings deck makes that a little more realistic to see that card just out of the deck. Again, not because I think it's too strong, but because I think it just kind of introduces an element of gameplay to the game that I think the game just doesn't need, and that most people don't want. That's kind of what my opinion on the card is. So you can tech against it, you can play Poison the Well and stuff like that, but I think it's just better for this card to flat out not exist, in my opinion.
I played it for one event and took it out. I don't like the play style that it supports.
And I still, even years later, hold the same opinion about Remembrance. So, again, LSS, if you're watching this, please consider banning these 2 cards. I think a lot of people would be happy about that.
Agreed.
All right. So we've gone over the history of Arakni now. This is all of the Arakni decks, or all of the Arakni cards that were like existing and were being played at various points in the history of the game and the history of the deck, all viewed through the lens of Etasus's personal list, obviously. So again, take that with a grain of salt. This does not necessarily represent what every person was doing on Arakni, but I think it's fair to say that there's probably very few people worldwide that have put in more thinking and more time on this hero than you. So I think
there's not many people on the hero at all. So it's not
that's true. But like even among those, I think you're probably on the forefront of like tinkering with the deck and playing around with it and trying out different things. So I think it's fair to say that this is like a decent representation of what the decks have looked like through the ages, basically the ages of Arakni. So while we're here, do you want to talk a little bit about what's coming for Arakni from the few cards that we've already seen, or would you want to leave that for a little bit later when we have more information about it?
No, we can definitely talk a little bit about that, because I do have a couple of things to say if you want to pull up the Hunted Spoilers there.
Yes.
So we've really seen like 4 cards here. The Defang, Extinguish, the new hero, and the attack reaction.
Tarantula Toxin,
when we're looking at the actual new cards, the 2 stealth contracts, what they are physically, like the actual cards themselves, that's draft chaff.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. I
Almost
don't care
certainly
about
you will never see these in a constructed deck. Yeah.
exactly. It's the other two cards that we've seen that are more interesting, and it's also defang what those two draft cards represent that is more interesting.
I think
Can,
these two things, the fact that they have stealth and contract on the same card for the first time, I think that's very relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll start with the easy one, the attack reaction. What that card is. That card is good. I think that is a very solid card. If you are running Shred, which I'm not because I don't like it, this is just better Shred.
Yep.
It is just a strictly better Shred, and maybe for that reason I might put it in my list, but I don't think I will because I don't think I care about my daggers getting the plus effect, and I don't think I care about defending attacks on my stealth attacks because of how I'm using my stealth attacks.
Yeah.
So maybe I might run the blue Tarantula Toxin, but even then, -1 block and +1 attack is not.
If that exists, even like we're not entirely sure. This isn't a Majestic, so this could be a Majestic. And then it would only do this. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I like this card for the deck. I'm not going to write it off completely. There could definitely be some more synergies that we see with it. But as of right now, I'm looking at it and I'm just like, I'm not sold on it.
I think like what this card does is it sort of like foreshadows a couple of things because of the word both here. So
yeah,
what you can 100%. currently this is almost irrelevant because like there's no stealth dagger in the game. So the only thing that you can do with this card is you can give a dagger +3 and then give -3 to a card defending a stealth attack on a previous chain link. And there's a few scenarios where that's relevant, specifically if you played, let's say, Prognosis and the opponent blocked it with equipment that has temper, and then you can like do this and destroy the temper equipment with it while your dagger still gets +3. But that's an incredibly niche scenario that will almost never come up in an actual game. So I think what
many things that have to happen for that.
Yeah, it's like it can happen, but it's like very niche, right? And then I think what this card kind of foreshadows is that we're going to get either a dagger that has stealth, so that you just use this card on this one dagger, or, and I think that's maybe the more likely one, is we're going to get a way to give attacks stealth. So some kind of ability, equipment, other card that just says the next thing you do has stealth. Kind of in the way what like Brand with Cinderclaw did for Fi, right? Or we've seen a couple of these in here already. Like all of these ninja cards say, yeah, if this is draconic, it does something extra, but none of them are draconic by themselves, right? So you need extra effects like the fealty token to actually make them draconic. And I think I could very much see some similar kind of mechanic existing for Assassin, where you can just tack stealth onto other cards.
Yeah, and that'll be really cool to see. The thing with that card specifically and that kind of interaction that might exist, I don't think it's going to happen for the Huntsman. Even if it does happen for the Huntsman, it's going to be the same thing as what Coercive Tendencies was doing in Heavy Hitters. It's going to be promoting a gameplay style that I don't think is something that we're going to want to do.
That makes sense.
I'm not going to write it off completely. Maybe they'll reveal something that I'm like, oh man, we're doing that. But until I see it, I don't believe it.
Yeah, makes sense.
Is how I'll put it. Then there's the other thing that I don't think is going to matter too much, which is Arakni slipped through the cracks. We have a new Arakni hero, which is really cool, but it's Chaos Assassin hero, so it's a new talent. And it is Arakni Solitary Confinement as an adult hero
with a symmetrical hero ability.
With a symmetrical hero ability with 38 health. And an ability that gives stealth cards go again. Theoretically, I could take my Huntsman list, how it currently looks, put it over into Arakni, slip through the cracks, and two things happen. First, I lose the Fate Seal, which is insane to lose. That is going to hurt a lot with what the deck is trying to do, but maybe it might be worth it because I gain Chaos, and also I gain a couple of weird counterplays where I can play like a Persuasive Prognosis into a Bonds of Excellence, right? Like I gain a couple of weird edge case things that could actually be really useful because of the stealth giving go again. It's not nothing. It's pretty good there, but I do gain Chaos. which could, depending on what the Chaos card pool looks like, it could be very worthwhile to do that and put it into my Huntsman deck. So it could be something where Huntsman
Yeah.
just gets moved over and is slipped through the cracks, and
Because
we
of the
take
talent
advantage of the new
specifically,
card
yeah.
pool.
Like
Yeah.
it's hard to tell. Like historically speaking, the strongest cards in talented heroes have typically been the talented cards. Specifically the talented class cards. Those were typically kind of the best. So if you look at Nu, the reason why Nu is good is not because of her hero ability. Because that's like irrelevant into like, I don't know, 80% of the decks, right? The reason why Nu is good is because she has access to the Mystic talent pool, which enables her to play cards like the two equipment pieces alone are super, super powerful. Like both Arousing Wave and the Stilettos are crazy good. Then you have like Hiss, you have Venomous Bite, you have Levels of Enlightenment, right? You just have a whole bunch of cards that only Nu is able to play because she's the only one that has access to that talent pool. And historically, if you look at other heroes that have a talent, the same tends to be true for them. Like the best cards in their respective pool typically tend to be talented cards that usually interface in some way with how they're trying to play the game. And I could totally see the same thing being true for Chaos. We just have no clue what that does. So it's kind of baseless to speculate on that. We just don't know what exactly Chaos is going to do for the hero, or how the Chaos cards are actually going to interface with the rest of the game. So until middle of December, we just have no clue if this is actually going to be a relevant part of their kit or not.
Yeah, I'm super excited for December 17th to see what happens there.
It's going to be very
what I'll
interesting.
say, though, is that from where I am sitting right now, looking at the two potential futures, where I either stick with Huntsman, and we'll talk a bit more about what might happen if I stick with Huntsman, or go with Slip Through the Cracks. Losing the Fate Seal ability loses a lot of what I enjoy about the hero. And so at the moment, I don't think that I'll be changing to a different Arakni. I think I'm probably going to stick with Huntsman, but I'm not going to write it off completely. I'm going to wait till we see the card pool, but from where I'm sitting right now, I don't want to lose the Fate Seal. And I'm probably just going to stick with Huntsman and gain some new support, which comes in the form of those other two cards up there. Not those cards specifically. Again, Draft Chaff, not going to be great.
What they're standing for, basically.
What they represent. Yes, it's stealth and contract. Interestingly, so the main thing that makes contract cards good is their stat line. 0 for 4s, 1 for 5s, 2 for 6. Really good stat line. Stealth contracts don't have that. They're 0 for 3, 0 for 2, 0 for 1. I don't think that I'm going to include very many of these cards unless there's a really good Majestic that's worth including. Except for the blue base. The blue base right now, Desires of Flesh and Art of Desire's Mind are both good. Like they're good. I like running them. Infect is great even. But if there are some better blue stealth cards with contract written on them, that could be really powerful for the deck. And so that is primarily what I'm looking for. When these new set spoilers are going to be coming out, I'm mostly going to be paying attention to the blue contracts, to the blue stealths there, to see what could come in that slot and what could impact the slot of my deck. And then obviously there's probably going to be some like attack reactions that are printed in it, like Tarantula, which I'll be paying attention to those as well. I'll look at them and see, maybe I'll run this one, maybe I'll run that one. Just like how Just the Nick got put in my deck, it'll kind of depend on an attack reaction on a card-by-card basis. But
how
I'll
good
be
are
paying
they
attention
going
to
to
those.
be?
Exactly. How good are they going to be? And I'll be paying attention to those cards, but I don't think any of them are going to be strong enough to warrant me running a red stealth contract. I don't think that'll happen. I don't think there'll be any cards that'll warrant running a red stealth contract in Huntsman. Of course, I'm going to keep an open mind. Maybe there will be.
Maybe there's some that have like some kind of active disruption. That I could totally see that making its way into lists. Like if there's a red stealth contract that has a disruptive effect, similar to like surgical prognosis, stuff like that, I could totally see that being played in basically any assassin, by the way. Like
the thing with that is, though, it's a 0 for 3. It's much different than a 0 for 4 stat line. It's why we're not running Infiltrate in any lists. Is because it's 0 for 3. So
I think the
even if there
main
is disruption, it's
infiltrate
gotta,
is like
yeah.
kind of weird disruption because it doesn't
Hmm.
immediately disrupt your opponent's next turn, and it's
Yeah.
very, very high rolly. Like it's a very high
Hmm.
variance card. You can hit like a D-react off of it, and then it's crazy good. Or you can hit something that's like super good for you to play on your next turn, and that's powerful. But it's just the problem is that it's completely dependent on what exactly your opponent is playing, and you have no control over it.
Hmm.
That's kind of the main issue with Infiltrate, I think. And why the card has never really seen any kind of play, just because it's too unreliable. That's the main issue with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I just when I'm thinking about a good red 0 for 3 stealth card with contract and some disruptive effect,
Hmm.
when I think about that kind of thing, it's just like it's gonna have to be pretty good for me to
Yeah.
consider taking Plunder the Poor out to put it in.
Yeah, that's
Plunder the
fair.
Poor is one of my worst cards in the deck,
Yeah.
but it comes with that 0 for 4 stat
It
line that
comes
is
with the
just
break point. Yeah.
it's very invaluable. So I'm going to be paying attention to this set release. I'm super excited for all of the cards in it,
Hmm.
and there are a couple things that I'm specifically looking for.
Yeah.
If we can get any fatigue breaking card, any card that means that we can break through Tech Load, through Bravo,
Hmm.
through Slab Dash,
Yeah.
anything like that, that is what I'm most looking for.
Hmm.
I really want to see an Arachne specialization that allows us to win those matchups because those
Yep.
are historically some of our worst ones. So that's what I'm looking for
Yeah.
the most. But honestly, there's a lot of cards that I would be very excited to put on my list.
I
There's
could
just
I
too
could
many to keep.
actually see that happening simply because
Mhm.
if we assume that Slip Through the Cracks is like the new Arachne, and I'm not entirely convinced it's gonna be the only new assassin we get from the set. Like, there's a decent chance that there's another assassin that they just haven't showed us yet, and there's also a
Mhm.
chance that that is also Arachne. I would not completely rule that out. Like, I think that's very much in the realm of possibility that we're gonna get a second Arachne as a main playable hero in this set.
Yeah, no,
But
I'd be willing to put money on it. I think we're getting a second Arachne, or
I could
not a
tell.
second Arachne, but a second assassin in this
Yeah,
set.
the
I
assassin.
think
Yeah, I don't know if
100%.
it's gonna be
Mhm.
Arachne, but there's probably gonna be another assassin in this set. I think this is a
Yeah.
4-hero set, not a 3-hero set.
Hmm. And I think it would be a really cool draft environment to have the two Draconic
Hmm.
heroes fighting over Draconic cards, and then the two Assassin heroes
Fighting
fighting over
over the
Assassin
chaos
cards.
cards and whatever assassin cards there are. Yeah,
Hmm.
so it's gonna be
Yeah,
pretty interesting. Yeah. And
very.
I think specifically, but what I was getting at, like specifically Slip Through the Cracks is gonna have a hard time dealing with fatigue, right? Because
Hmm.
what Slip Through the Cracks basically is sort of like a more aggro slanted assassin, similar to basically solitary confinement. It's essentially solitary confinement in
Hmm.
CC, except it's worse against other assassins. That's kind of like because the hero
Yeah.
ability is symmetrical, right? Like their stealth attacks get go again too. But what you can do with this is you can construct a deck that runs a whole bunch of stealth cards, red ones, right? And then you can extract value from those because Infect, in theory, is a 0 for 5 if it hits.
Hmm.
It's just a
Yeah.
0 for 5 that's easy to block out, right? But it is, if the opponent just doesn't block, it's a 0 for 5. So it's above rate inherently. Similar to that, if you look at stuff like Prowl is a 0 for 4 in this deck with Go Again. Pretty powerful. 0 for 4 with Go Again that still blocks 3 is a very good card. Like, that's something that a lot of heroes would just instantly slap in the deck if they had it, right? And
Yeah.
and in that way, a lot of the stealth cards have like they're only coming in for 3, but they have extra value stapled to them. So let's say Art of Desire Body, for example, is a 0 for 3 with Go Again that against the right deck gains your life and draws you a card. So it's like effectively 0 for 7 with Go Again, which
Hmm.
is crazy. And that's kind of like, I think that's what Slip Through the Cracks is probably going to try to do, is like just run a whole bunch of these red stealth attacks and then probably also a bunch of the blue ones, because I don't think this will be like a pure red line deck where you just run like 6 blues and that's it. Primarily because we'll have Jarl to contend with by the time this comes out. And I think a
Hmm.
lot of people are going to be on Jarl simply because Ice is one of a lot of people's favorite talent to play. And if
Hmm.
you're in a meta that has an Ice hero, you can't really play pure red line decks. It's just not something that's super viable. You need to be able to have pitch in order to pay for things. And a pure redline deck, like what this might possibly look like if you're just really running red stealth attacks, just doesn't really have a way to get around ice, just increasing their resource cost. So I think whatever this ends up being is going to be a deck that probably runs a whole bunch of red stealths and then like maybe 15 to 20 blues. Also to just take advantage of cards like Prognosis, Bonds of Agony, and also probably just the Nick because they're just really good cards. So this is kind of like what I'm envisioning for this hero. But that specific hero is going to have an issue against fatigue decks.
Yeah, so then it could definitely have some form of anti-fatigue specialization.
As a spec, I could totally see
and
that.
That'd be great. I'd be such a huge fan of that. Just please don't put chaos.
Yeah, that would suck. If they put chaos on that would not be a great day for Arakni, but
no. I do think Slip Through the Cracks is going to be the strongest assassin moving forward. I do think Slip Through the Cracks will easily be better than New, easily better than Azuri, just because we've seen what solitary confinement can do in Blitz.
True.
And seeing the strength that's available there, it's a no-brainer to me. I feel like Slip Through the Cracks is just going to be a really good deck, but unlike the other assassins, it will be incredibly susceptible to fatigue, exactly like what you were saying.
I do think it's going to be a pretty strong deck, but I do think that basically scaling up the life totals from 20 to 40 does make that hero ability significantly worse. Like not to the point where it's bad. I'm not saying that. I still think it's a pretty solid hero ability, and I think it's gonna be a strong assassin hero, but I don't agree that it's necessarily going to be the strongest assassin from the get-go. We'll see how it ends up working out, but I can see specifically New having a pretty good matchup into this, actually.
I think the more important thing with it is that we've talked at length about this in the past, that assassin as a class is just something that not very great into an open meta. Really needs a tighter meta to be able to work the most effectively. And I think Slipped Through the Cracks represents like the best hero that we've ever gotten into an open meta.
That's true.
Just the fact that Slipped Through the Crack can be super aggressive, I think represents something really powerful for
because it's an aggro deck. It's way better at setting the pace of the game. I think that's definitely true.
Exactly.
And then having Go Again on stealth cards also enables you to play a whole bunch of cards that are just kind of unplayable without having that Go Again. So that's also kind of like, you can just get some extra value from that. You can play like the stealth attack reactions, for example, because you just can afford to have a really high density of stealth cards in your deck. So you can suddenly play stuff like Razor's Edge, which is a terrible card. Otherwise, that card sucks. But you can play like the Spikes, which are pretty good, actually, without hating yourself for it. And then you have extra cards that are able to turn Bonds of Agony live. I mean, hey, if my dream comes true, this is a deck that can play Redback Shroud. I would love for that to happen. I don't think it's going to, but it might.
It depends on whether we see silver in some of the other contracts, I think.
I kind of doubt that, but it's possible. Like at this stage, because we know so little about the set, anything's open, anything's possible. So, and I think that's probably a good like ending point for this video, because anything we can add at this point is like complete baseless speculation, where we just kind of like shoot in the blue and see, you know, just come up with a couple of wild ideas what might happen. And I think everyone out there is already doing a lot of that. So that's kind of like not adding a whole lot to the discussion. But hey, if any of you have like crazy ideas about what might be in the Hunted, just leave them down in the comments below. Likewise, if any of you have any questions for Etasus about any of his deck lists or about Arakni in general, also leave them down in the comments. You can find both of us on the Spider's Web Discord, which is a Discord specifically for the Assassin class. I will also leave a link to that down in the description of the video. And with that, I think it's a good time to end this. Do you have any last words, anything out there for prospective Arakni enjoyers?
Yeah, it's a great hero to play, and this is a great time to be getting into Arachne. Given the new set is going to be coming out in a couple months here.
Yep.
This is the best that Arachne has ever been. There's a lot of strength in this deck, and it's not to be undervalued. It is a tough learning curve. This is not an easy deck to just
Yeah.
get in on, but if you can put the reps in, if you can get the time in there, I promise you this is rewarding. This is my favorite hero. I love talking about Arachne. And I can talk at length. I'm in the Spider's Web Discord. You can find me in the Purple Discord. I'll be paying attention to the comments below this. I'm always down to talk shop about Arachne. This is just the coolest hero I think in the game, and I will always be playing them.
All right. So
Yeah.
again, thank you for being here. Thank you for talking
Yeah.
about Arachne with me. It's been great to have you on the channel.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, I think it's time to end this and see you guys in the next one.
All right. See you around.